She baked his wedding cake. Not his wedding, the wedding of the man who had left her with nothing but a voicemail and a drawer full of receipts she couldn't afford to pay. Grace Holloway stood in the back corner of the most beautiful reception she had ever seen, flowers still ghosted beneath her fingernails, wearing the only dress she owned that didn't have a hole somewhere, watching 200 people celebrate a love story that had been built on the ruins of hers. She wasn't supposed to feel anything. She had promised herself she wouldn't. She felt everything. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. Let me see how far this story has traveled. And if you stay until the very last word, don't forget to hit that like button. Because this one is going to cost you some tears. The cake had taken her 4 days. 4 days of early mornings and late nights in the back of a bakery that smelled permanently of burnt sugar and old wood, where the refrigeration unit hummed so loud it sometimes drowned out her own thoughts, which, lately, had been the only mercy the universe seemed willing to offer her. 6 tiers. French vanilla and elderflower. Hand-piped sugar flowers in blush and ivory that Grace had spent an entire Tuesday evening constructing one petal at a time, hunched over a work table under a lamp that flickered every 20 minutes like it was keeping its own kind of time. Her lower back had ached, her fingers had cramped. She had burned the first batch of the bottom tier and stood in the kitchen at midnight, staring at a ruined pan of cake, doing the math in her head about whether she could afford to start over. She could not afford to start over. She started over anyway. That was the thing about Grace Holloway that most people never bothered to notice. She always started over. Even when she shouldn't. Even when the math was wrong and the hours were gone, and the sensible thing, the self-preserving thing, would have been to walk away. Walking away had never come naturally to her, which was probably why she was standing here now, at the edge of the Callaway Estate's grand reception hall, watching Daniel Whitmore slow dance with his new wife. The first time she'd seen his name on the order form, she'd read it twice. Then she'd read it a third time, slower, the way you reread a sentence you're sure can't mean what it means. Whitmore Harrington Wedding, 6-tier ceremonial cake, delivery and full service required on-site, deposit attached. The deposit was $3,000, rendered in a cashier's check that Patrice, Grace's employer, and the closest thing she had to a boss without being anything like a boss, had already deposited into the bakery's account before Grace even came in that morning. "I took it," Patrice had said, before Grace could open her mouth. Patrice was 61, wore the same 2 aprons in rotation, and had the voice of a woman who had survived enough nonsense that she no longer had patience for preamble. "I know what you're going to say. I don't want to hear it." "Patrice, the water bill is 6 weeks past due. The oven in the back kicks out whenever we run it past 3:50. Jimmy down the street is opening a dessert cafe in October, and he's already got a sign up." She crossed her arms. "We needed that deposit, so I took it." Grace had stood there in her coat, bag still over her shoulder, looking at the order form on the counter. "His name is on this," she said. "I know whose name is on it. I know what he did." Patrice's voice went quieter, which somehow made it harder to argue with. "I also know that this bakery has been my whole life for 32 years, and I am not closing it because you had a bad boyfriend, baby. I'm sorry. I am, but that's where we are." Grace had picked up the form, looked at it for a long moment, set it back down. "Fine," she said. That was the whole conversation. Damn it. She hadn't told anyone what the job actually meant. Not the part about Daniel. She'd simply gone home to her apartment, the one with the cracked bathroom tile she'd been meaning to fix for a year and a half, and sat on her bed in her coat and looked at the opposite wall for a while. Daniel Whitmore had not been a villain. That was the most exhausting part of the whole thing. He hadn't cheated on her, hadn't lied about anything fundamental. He had simply looked at Grace one afternoon, 2.5 years into what she'd thought was a serious relationship, and said, with the kind of gentle sadness that almost felt considerate, "I think I need someone who's more put together, you know?" Put together. She'd been 27, working 60 hours a week at the bakery, sending $200 a month home to her mother in Clarksville because the rent on her mother's fixed income had gone up and someone had to cover the gap. Her apartment had secondhand furniture, and she bought her clothes at consignment shops and she ate lunch at the bakery most days because it was cheaper than going out. She was not, by most reasonable definitions, put together. But she had been happy. She had been genuinely, carefully happy. The kind of happy that doesn't make a lot of noise, but that you feel in the way you sleep, in the way Tuesday mornings don't feel like punishment, in the way you sometimes hum without meaning to while you're washing dishes. She had lost that. The Tuesday mornings had not recovered, and now she was going to spend 4 days baking his wedding cake. She had gone to the bathroom, splashed cold water on her face, looked at her own reflection for 10 solid seconds. Okay, she said to herself, and then she'd done it. The estate was 40 minutes outside the city, up a winding 2-lane road that Grace had to GPS twice because she missed the turn both times. She drove a 2011 Honda Civic with a dent in the rear bumper that made a sound like a low cough when she accelerated past 50. She'd loaded the cake tiers into the trunk with obsessive precision, boxed and cushioned and strapped down, checking the rear view every 2 minutes the entire drive, as if she could will the vibrations to behave. She didn't own a proper delivery vehicle. The bakery didn't own a proper delivery vehicle. This was just how they did things, carefully, anxiously, with too much packing foam and not enough prayer. The Callaway estate appeared around a bend in the road, and Grace actually said, out loud to no one, "You have got to be kidding me." It was the kind of property that existed in the periphery of most people's imagination, the thing you see in a magazine and register vaguely as something that belongs to someone else's world. Rolling grounds that were too manicured to look entirely natural. A main house made of pale stone that caught the October afternoon light and turned it gold. Flower arrangements visible through the open front gates that cost more than Grace's monthly rent, probably more than her quarterly rent. There was a service entrance. Of course there was a service entrance. A coordinator named Melissa, late 20s, clipboard, the specific energy of someone who had managed 4 major crises before noon, met Grace at the side gate and walked her through to the kitchen with the brisk efficiency of someone who had no time for small talk and would gently destroy anyone who required it. 6 tiers, yes? You'll have full use of the kitchen prep area. Assembly will need to be complete by 4 for the reception timeline. Do you need anything? Just counter space and about 40 minutes, Grace said. Melissa looked at her like this was both acceptable and not particularly interesting. Done. The assembly took 53 minutes, not 40, because the 3rd tier had shifted slightly during transport, and Grace spent 11 minutes carefully correcting it with a small offset spatula, working with the focused patience of someone diffusing something that would absolutely blow up in her face if she rushed. The kitchen was extraordinary. She couldn't help noticing. Professional grade everything, 6 burners, 2 ovens, a refrigeration setup that ran silently like a well-kept secret. Someone used this kitchen seriously, or had at some point. It didn't have the sterile perfection of a space maintained for appearances. It had the particular warmth of somewhere that had actually fed people. Grace noticed things like that. It was an occupational habit she'd never been able to turn off. By the time the cake was assembled and placed on its display table in the reception hall, the wedding party was already drifting in for photographs. Grace stepped back to the edge of the room, cleaned her spatula, capped it, tucked it into her kit. She should have left then. Melissa had told her she could leave after placement, that there was no need to stay for the reception. The check, the remainder of their fee, which Patrice needed desperately, would be mailed by the end of the week. She should have gotten in her car and driven home and eaten dinner in front of whatever was on television and gone to sleep and called it a professional victory and moved on. Instead, she was still standing at the edge of the room 45 minutes later when Daniel Whitmore walked into his own reception with his hand on the small of his new wife's back. Her name, Grace had gathered, was Sophia. She was beautiful in the effortless, unconsidered way that some women are beautiful. Tall, dark-haired, wearing a gown that had clearly been made for her body specifically, laughing at something Daniel said with her whole face the way you do when someone genuinely makes you happy. Grace felt nothing hostile towards Sophia. That was the strange part. Sophia hadn't done anything to her. What she felt was something more complicated and quieter, the specific grief of watching someone be the thing you thought you were going to get to be, like watching someone else open a gift with your name on it. She stood there too long. She knew it. She watched the first dance and the toasts and the cutting of the cake, her cake, with its hand-piped flowers and its perfect elderflower ganache. And somewhere around the third toast, she realized she had stopped breathing quite right and needed to be outside immediately. The gardens at the back of the estate were lit with strings of warm light, but not crowded. The reception noise softened as Grace pushed through the side door, becoming a distant murmur, something you could almost convince yourself was just wind through the trees. She walked until the music was mostly gone, found a stone bench near what appeared to be a kitchen garden, raised beds that had been put to sleep for winter, neat rows of turned earth, a few late herbs still hanging on against the cold. She sat down and put her kit bag on the bench beside her and looked at the sky for a while. The sky was doing nothing in particular. That was fine. It was doing it quietly. She had been sitting there for maybe 8 minutes, doing the focused work of getting herself back together in the way that takes enormous effort and looks, from the outside, like nothing at all, when she heard footsteps on the gravel path. She almost didn't look up. She wished, briefly, that she hadn't. The man who came around the bend of the garden path was carrying 2 glasses of water. He was tall, not ostentatiously, just genuinely tall in the way some people are, like they simply took up the allotted space. Dark jacket, no tie, the jacket looking like it had started the evening properly and then been lived in for several hours. He had the kind of face that wasn't conventionally handsome in any magazine cover way, but was deeply interesting. A strong jaw that needed a shave, dark eyes that were currently aimed at the ground in front of him. The particular set of someone who was also, in their own way, escaping something. He almost walked past her. Then he looked up. They registered each other with the mutual startled recognition of 2 people who were both supposed to be alone out here and had each failed at it independently. "Sorry," he said, stopping. "I didn't realize anyone was—" He glanced at the bench, at her, at the kit bag. "Are you with the Florals?" Grace blinked. The Florals. The floral team had been packing up near the side entrance when she'd walked out. He must have seen them. "Something like that," she said. She didn't know why she said that. She opened her mouth to correct it immediately, and then, for some reason that she couldn't have articulated clearly, didn't. The man looked at the empty space on the bench, then at the 2 water glasses in his hands with a kind of mild uncertainty, like he hadn't fully thought through his plan when he'd taken them from the reception. "It's warmer out here than inside," he said. Which was not strictly true. It was October and the temperature had dropped into the 50s. But she understood what he meant. "Yeah," she said. He held out one of the glasses. "I grabbed 2 by accident, or—" He stopped, reconsidered. "I don't know if that's true, actually. I might have been hoping someone out here would want one." Grace looked at the glass, then at him. She took it. He sat down on the other end of the bench, leaving a respectful distance of approximately 2 feet, with the air of someone asking an unspoken question about whether this was acceptable. She did not move away. He seemed to read this correctly and settled in. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The reception music drifted over faintly, something slow and generic that every wedding seemed to own. "You're not a guest," she said. It came out as a statement, not a question. "No, He paused. "It's my garden, actually. So." He said it with very little pride, just factual, the way you'd say it's my umbrella about an umbrella you'd forgotten you'd left somewhere. Grace looked at him properly for the first time, something recalibrated. "Your garden," she repeated. "My estate," he said. Then quickly, like he was aware of how that sounded and didn't love it. "I rent it out for events. I don't usually—" He gestured back toward the reception. "I don't usually attend them. Tonight I was in my study, and I heard the music, and I thought I'd get water and go back upstairs, and somehow I've ended up here." He looked at the raised beds, not entirely sure how. "The gravity of the kitchen garden," Grace said. He turned to look at her. The ghost of something appeared on his face. Not quite a smile yet, but the infrastructure for one. "The what?" "Places like this have a pull," she said. "Especially if you're—" She stopped herself because she'd been about to say if you're hiding, and she didn't know this man, and that was too much. "If you need a minute," she finished. He was quiet for a second. "Yeah," he said. "I needed a minute." "Me too." They sat with that for a while, and it was the comfortable kind of quiet. the kind that doesn't demand to be filled. "Ethan," he said, and put his hand out. She shook it. "Grace, what part of the florals are you?" She almost laughed. "The part that's taking a break." They talked for 23 minutes. She knew because she could see the edge of her watch from where her arm rested on the bench, and she was still, in some background part of her brain, aware of the timeline. When she should get back, when she should get her car, how long the drive home was. He asked where she'd trained. She said she hadn't, not formally, just years of doing it. He said that was usually how the best people learn things, and he said it without the patronizing edge that phrase sometimes carried, just matter-of-fact and genuine. She asked if he was at every event on the estate. He said no. Usually he was upstairs with his daughter. She'd wanted to come to the reception tonight because she liked the lights, and he'd brought her down for an hour before putting her to bed. "How old?" Grace asked. 7, he said. "She's been practicing flower arrangements with whatever she can find in the yard. She had opinions about the florals tonight." He paused. "Diplomatic opinions." Diplomatic like she kept them to herself, or diplomatic like she said them nicely? Diplomatic like she told the florist her roses were very brave and meant it as a criticism. Grace actually laughed at that. Not a polite laugh, a real one, surprised out of her. He smiled then, fully, and it changed his face in a way that was worth seeing. "She sounds like a character," Grace said. "She's a whole production," he said, and there was something in his voice when he talked about his daughter that was so uncomplicated and warm that it was almost startling, like a room you walked into expecting ordinary furniture and found something quietly extraordinary instead. The slow song from the reception drifted over again, or another one like it. Ethan stood up, held out his hand. "I realize this is strange," he said, "but I haven't danced in a while, and the music's right there, and you're here. Would you—" He stopped. "You can absolutely say no." Grace looked at his hand. She should have said no. She was a bakery employee who had just spent 4 days making the wedding cake for her ex-boyfriend's wedding, and she was currently sitting in the garden of a billionaire's estate in a dress she'd bought for $40 2 years ago, and she had absolutely no business dancing with anyone tonight. She stood up and took his hand. He was a careful dancer, not showy. He kept the distance of someone who was being respectful, one hand light at her waist, the other holding hers with the same consideration he'd shown when he offered her water. They moved to the edges of the music, slow and unhurried, on a stone path between winter-dark garden beds. "You're thinking very hard," he said quietly. "Bad habit." "What are you thinking about?" She almost told him. The whole thing. The cake, Daniel, the deposit, Patrice's face when she'd said, "I know what he did," and stared at a water bill. The fact that she was 30 years old and had never in her life felt particularly put together and was not sure she was going to start now. "Just work stuff," she said. He nodded like he understood that, like he knew what it was to have something permanent sitting at the back of your mind that you were actively choosing not to look at. "Me too," he said. They danced until the song ended. Then they stood there for a second, still loosely holding hands, and the night air was cold and the music had switched to something louder, and the moment gently and naturally completed itself the way real moments do. Not with a crash or a conclusion, just with a quiet, "Here is where this stops." "Thank you for the company," Grace said. "Thank you for the water glass," he said. "The one I definitely took by accident." She smiled. "Right." She picked up her kit bag. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. "Take care, Grace," he said. "You too, Ethan." She walked back through the side door, through the warmth and noise of a reception she had no business being at, out through the service entrance, and to her car in the vendor parking area. She loaded her empty boxes into the trunk. Got in. Sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. The drive home was 40 minutes. She made it in 43 because she missed the turn again. She didn't think about Ethan on the drive home. She thought about the cake, about whether the ganache had held up through the evening, about whether anyone had noticed the slight correction on the third tier, or whether it had been invisible by the time it reached the display table, about whether Patrice would be awake when she texted her, and what exactly she was going to say. She thought about Daniel, briefly, not with longing, or not exactly, but with the strange anthropological curiosity of watching someone you used to know become fully someone else. He'd looked happy. That was the truthful thing she could say about it. He'd looked genuinely happy, and she'd looked at his happiness and felt not bitterness but something more exhausting, the complete absence of surprise. She'd known, on some level, that he would be fine, that people like Daniel were always fine, that the specific wreckage of their ending had affected her in ways that had calcified into parts of how she moved through the world, the slight defensiveness, the expectation of disappointment, the way she automatically prepared for the versions of things that fell short of what they'd promised, and had affected him not at all, apparently, and that asymmetry was its own specific kind of grief. She pulled into her apartment parking lot at 11:47 p.m. Her phone had 2 texts from Patrice, the first from 3 hours ago, "How's it going?" and the second from 40 minutes ago, "I'm assuming no news is good news, call me tomorrow." Grace typed, "Cake went perfectly, checks coming this week, get some sleep." She sat in the car for another minute. The night had been strange. The whole day had been the kind of strange that doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates around you quietly until you're standing in a garden, dancing with a man you don't know while your ex-boyfriend's wedding reception goes on 20 yards away. And you realize this is simply what your life has become. And there is nothing to do about that but get up tomorrow and start the bread dough. She got out of the car. The stairs to her apartment had a loose third step that she'd been meaning to report for 4 months. She stepped over it, as she always did, by habit and resignation. Inside, she hung up the dress, washed the flour from under her fingernails that she'd thought she'd gotten earlier and hadn't, made herself a piece of toast because she'd forgotten to eat dinner properly, and ate it standing at the kitchen counter because sitting down felt like a commitment she wasn't ready for. The apartment was quiet. The cracked bathroom tile glinted in the light when she went in to wash her face. She looked at her reflection. 30 years old, tired. Flower ghost on her left elbow that she'd somehow missed twice. The dress of a woman who was making do, and making do reasonably well, and aware of the difference between those two things. "Okay," she said to herself. Same word as always, same steady, stubborn word that she'd been saying to her own reflection for years, in various apartments and various states of exhausted and various early mornings before various difficult things. She went to bed. She did not let herself think about the hand at her waist, or the careful way it had held her, or the specific warmth of a moment in a dark garden with someone who had also needed a minute. She was mostly successful. 3 days later, Patrice called at 7:14 in the morning. Grace was already in the bakery, hadn't been able to sleep past 5, was in the middle of shaping the first round of sourdough with the focused autopilot of someone whose hands knew exactly what they were doing without requiring her conscious participation. "You need to see something," Patrice said, in the voice she used when she was trying to sound calm and was not calm. "Good morning to you, too." "Grace," the voice tightened. "Come out front." Grace covered the dough, wiped her hands, went through the swinging door to the front of the shop. Patrice was standing behind the counter holding her phone. On the screen was a photograph. She could see it from across the room, though she couldn't make out the details yet. She crossed the bakery, took the phone. It was a photo taken at the Whitmore Harrington wedding. Some guest's Instagram, the hashtag visible at the bottom. The frame showed the cake table, beautifully lit, the 6 tiers perfectly composed, the sugar flowers catching the light in exactly the way Grace had intended them to. The caption said, "The most extraordinary wedding cake I've ever seen. At Callaway State Events, do you know who made this?" Below it, in the comments, was an account she didn't recognize. A clean, minimal profile, no personal photos, the name Ethan Blackwood. His comment read, "I do, actually, working on it." Grace stared at the screen for a long moment. "Who is Ethan Blackwood?" Patrice said. Grace thought about a stone bench and 2 water glasses, and a man who'd said "it's my garden" like it was almost embarrassing. "He's the owner of the estate," she said. Patrice looked at her. "You talked to him?" "Briefly." "He knew you made the cake?" She stopped. He'd thought she was the florist. She'd never corrected him. Somehow, in the space between that conversation and now, he'd found out. "I do, actually, working on it." She handed the phone back. "What does working on it mean?" Patrice asked. "I don't know," Grace said. She went back through the swinging door and stood at the bread table and pressed her palms flat against the cool surface and breathed out slowly. Her hands were still. She was not. She picked up the dough and started shaping again. 7 minutes later, the bakery phone rang. Patrice answered it. Grace could hear her voice through the door, formal at first, then surprised, then formal again in the way that meant she was trying to be professional in the face of something she was not prepared for. The door swung open. "It's for you," Patrice said. Her voice had gone completely even, which was how Grace knew she was either very pleased or trying very hard not to be. "It's Ethan Blackwood." Grace looked at her hands, looked at the dough, looked at Patrice. "Tell him I'll call back in." "Grace," Patrice held the phone out. "Take the call." She took the call. "Ms. Holloway," said the voice she recognized, quieter over the phone than it had been in the garden. A little more formal, but still with the same quality of saying exactly what it meant without performing it. "This is Ethan Blackwood. I'm the owner of Callaway Estate. We met briefly at the Whitmore wedding." "I remember," she said. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I thought you were the florist." "I know. I found out afterward that you'd made the cake." A pause. "I spent part of last night watching my daughter try to eat her breakfast with the same level of concentration you were putting into that third tier during assembly. I happened to walk past and see you through the kitchen window. I've been thinking about it since." Grace said nothing. She wasn't sure what to say. "The reason I'm calling," he continued, with the air of someone who had rehearsed this and was now trying to sound like he hadn't, "is that I host an annual harvest festival on the estate in 6 weeks. We typically have a dessert and pastry component that's been," he seemed to search for the word, "adequate. I'd like it to be considerably more than adequate this year. I'd like to offer you the contract." The bakery was very quiet. Grace could hear Patrice breathing through the door, which meant Patrice had her ear pressed to the door, which was not remotely subtle. "Mr. Blackwood, Ethan," he said. "Please." "Ethan." She turned her back to the door, not that it helped. "That's very generous, but I'd need to know." "The budget is $40,000, he said. "That includes the commission, materials, and any staffing you need to bring." She heard Patrice make a small, suppressed sound on the other side of the door. $40,000. The water bill was 6 weeks past due. The back oven needed repair. Jimmy down the street was opening a dessert cafe in October and already had a sign-up. "I'd need to come see the kitchen," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "And we'd need to discuss scope and timeline." "Of course," he said. "Name the day." She named it. She hung up. The door swung open immediately, which meant Patrice had been holding the handle. $40,000, Patrice said. "We don't have it yet," Grace said. "But we could." "But we could," Grace agreed. Patrice looked at her for a long moment. She had the face of someone who wanted very much to say a great many things and was exercising considerable restraint. "The man on the phone," she said carefully, "is he—" "He's a client," Grace said. "Potentially." "Right." Patrice nodded slowly. "A client. That's all." "Of course." Patrice picked up a dish towel, put it down again. "He asked for you specifically." "Patrice?" "I'm just noting it." "I know you are. The owner of an entire estate." "Patrice, I'm going to go back to the bread now." She went back to the bread. Her hands were still shaping. The rhythm of it was the same as it always was. Press, turn, fold, press. And the dough was behaving exactly as dough behaved, and the bakery smelled the same as it always smelled, and outside the window the street was doing its ordinary morning things. Everything was the same. Something, almost imperceptibly, was not. She pressed her palms into the dough and felt the resistance of it, the living, breathing, stubborn resistance of something that needed time and pressure and patience before it would become what it was meant to be. She understood that. She had always understood that. She worked until the bread was done. Then she went home, changed out of her flour-covered clothes, stood in front of her small closet for longer than was probably necessary, and began thinking about what you wore to a meeting with the man whose estate you'd spent the better part of a decade's equivalent budget on dancing in when you were supposed to be leaving. She landed on the same dress. It would have to be enough. It always had been. The dress was wrong, and she knew it before she even got in the car. It was the same dress from the wedding. The $40 one, navy blue, respectable enough. And in the 3 days between Ethan's phone call and the scheduled meeting, Grace had told herself 4 separate times that it was fine, that clothes were not the point, that she was going to Callaway Estate to look at a kitchen and discuss a contract, and nothing about that required her to own something better than what she had. She told herself this while ironing the dress at 6 in the morning. She told herself this while driving 40 minutes up the same winding road, missing the same turn, adding 3 minutes to the drive in the same exact spot. She told herself this while a different person, not Melissa this time, a younger man named Cole, who had the slightly harried look of someone who was always 3 tasks behind, met her at the front entrance instead of the service gate. The front entrance. She noticed that. Cole walked her through the main hall, which was the kind of room that made you aware, immediately and without apology, of how much space money could buy. Not ostentatious exactly. The furniture was quality but not showy, the art on the walls chosen by someone with taste, rather than someone trying to demonstrate they had taste. But it was large in a way that recalibrated everything around it. Grace kept her face neutral and her pace steady and did not let herself look up at the ceiling, which was the kind of ceiling that wanted to be looked at. Ethan was already in the kitchen. That was the first thing that surprised her. She'd half expected to be led into some mahogany-paneled office and presented with a contract across a large desk, the kind of meeting that was really about establishing who was in charge. Instead, Cole pushed open the kitchen door and Ethan was standing at the center island with what appeared to be a notepad and a cold cup of coffee, wearing a dark blue sweater that had a small pull near the left cuff, reading something and frowning at it with the concentration of a man who had not yet noticed he was being watched. He looked up. Miss Holloway. He set the notepad down and the frown cleared into something more present. You found it. I missed the turn, she said honestly. Everyone does. He came around the island, hand out. Thank you for coming. She shook it. His grip was the same as in the garden, firm without performing it. Thank you for the opportunity. They looked at each other for a beat, the way people do when they've met under one set of circumstances and are now recalibrating under different ones. In the garden, in the dark, at a distance of 2 feet, and with the buffer of pretending she was someone else, he had been one version of himself. In his own kitchen, with a notepad and a cold coffee, he was more plainly who he was, which was, she noted, not different in any way that mattered. Just clearer. The kitchen, he said, and turned. It was better than it had looked during the wedding assembly. In the chaos of that evening, the coordination, the timeline pressure, the emotional static she'd been managing underneath everything else, she'd registered the space as professional and leave it at that. Now she walked through it properly, opening things, checking the ovens, pulling out a drawer to look at the depth of it, running a hand along the edge of the cold marble prep surface. He watched her do this without interrupting, which she appreciated. Both ovens? She asked. Both work. The left one runs about 5 degrees hot. I've been meaning to have it calibrated. She made a note. Refrigeration? The tall unit on the right is the newest, 2 years old. The under-counter ones are older, but they've been serviced. Mixer, he pointed. Commercial KitchenAid, the kind that costs more than her car. She crossed to it, checked the bowl fit, tested the lock. Attachments. Whatever came with it. There's a box somewhere. He looked around vaguely. Cole knows where it is. She turned around and looked at the whole room with her hands on her hips and her head making calculations she couldn't have entirely articulated. This was the instinctive part of the job, the part where you stopped reading the room with your eyes and started reading it with your hands and your feet, where you understood not just what a kitchen could hold, but how it would feel to actually work in it for 12 hours straight when everything was going wrong, and the 4th batch wasn't setting and someone needed an answer in 30 seconds. This kitchen would work. This kitchen would, in fact, work beautifully. Okay, she said. Okay? He seemed to be reading her tone carefully. It's a good kitchen. She turned back to him. Now tell me about the festival. What does the dessert component look like currently? What's the footfall? What are the time windows for service? And what exactly do you mean by considerably more than adequate? Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise, exactly, but the particular quality of a person who had expected one conversation and found themselves in a better one. He picked up his notepad. "Sit down," he said. "The coffee's cold, but there's more." The meeting lasted 2.5 hours. It was the kind of meeting that didn't feel like a meeting. It felt like two people figuring something out together, which was a different animal entirely. Ethan Blackwood, she discovered, was not the kind of wealthy person who believed that having opinions was the same as having knowledge. He had ideas about the festival and shared them clearly, but when she pushed back, when she said, "That timeline doesn't work because of the chilling requirements," or "You can't serve macarons outdoors in October, the humidity will destroy them by the second hour." He didn't argue. He wrote it down. He asked why. He actually asked why, and then actually listened to the answer. She wasn't accustomed to that. The listening part. "The anchor piece," she said near the end, her own notes now occupying 3 pages of the small notebook she'd brought, "should be something that people will remember. Not because it's the most technically difficult thing I can make, it's not, but because it fits the event. The Harvest Festival is about the estate, the season, the land here specifically. The centerpiece should come from that. Whatever grows on the property, whatever's local. I'd want to walk the grounds before I finalize the concept." Ethan looked at her for a moment. "You want to walk the grounds," he said. "The kitchen garden in the back? Is any of it still producing?" "Some. The late-season herbs are holding on. There's an apple orchard on the east side of the property, 2 varieties. Some quince along the fence that nobody planted. It just came up one year and we kept it." "Quince," she said, and wrote it down. "You can do something with quince." "Quince is extraordinary," she said, with more feeling than she'd meant to put into it. "Most people don't know what to do with it, so they don't bother, but it's one of the most complex flavors in autumn. It holds up to long cooking in a way that apples don't. You can take it in 10 different directions depending on what you pair it with." She caught herself. "Sorry, Don't apologize," he said. She stopped. He was looking at her with an attention that was not uncomfortable but was very present. "I asked because I wanted to know," he said. "Don't apologize for knowing things." Grace looked down at her notebook, wrote quince, orchard, and underlined it. "I can have a preliminary concept to you by end of next week," she said, "once I've walked the property." "Name the day," he said, same as on the phone. They landed on Thursday. He walked her to the front door himself rather than calling Cole. At the threshold, in the afternoon light that had come out cautiously from behind the clouds, he looked slightly like he was working something out. "The night of the wedding," he said. "You let me think you were the florist." It wasn't an accusation. It was just a question living inside a statement. "I know," she said. "I was going to correct it." "But?" She thought about it honestly. "I needed a minute too," she said. "And I didn't want to be the wedding cake person in that particular minute." He looked at her for a moment. "I understand that more than you'd think," he said. She nodded, got in her car. Missed the turn again because apparently the turn was simply her problem now, a permanent feature of any visit to this estate, like a toll she paid in mild humiliation for the right of access. She drove home thinking about quince. Thursday was cold and bright, the kind of October day that commits to itself. Ethan met her at the front entrance again. This time there was a small person standing slightly behind his left leg, peering out at Grace with the frank evaluative gaze of a child who hadn't yet learned that staring was considered rude by adults, and hadn't decided to care about that anyway. She had dark eyes like her father's, dark hair pulled into a braid that had clearly started the morning tidy and was now winning its argument with the hair tie. She was wearing a puffy orange vest over a striped long-sleeve shirt and muddy boots, which suggested she had already been outside this morning and found something interesting there. "This is my daughter," Ethan said. "Lily." "Hi," Grace said. Lily looked at her with the solemn assessment of the very young. "Are you the cake person?" "I am." "Dad said you made the cake at the wedding, the one with the flowers." "That's right." Lily considered this. The flowers were better than the real flowers, she said, with the easy certainty of someone who had not yet learned to soften her opinions for polite company. "Lily," Ethan said, in the voice of a parent who was trying. "I'm just saying what I thought," Lily said. Grace said, "The florist was very good. The flowers were beautiful." Lily looked at her steadily. "But yours were better." There was a pause. "Yes," Grace said, "mine were better." Ethan pressed his mouth together in the way of a person suppressing a laugh. Lily seemed satisfied with this exchange and stepped out from behind her father's leg. "Can I come?" she asked him. "If you stay on the path and don't pick anything without asking." "I know the rules, Dad." "You do know the rules," he agreed. "You also know the rules about the greenhouse, and you were in there for 40 minutes last Tuesday." "That was different." "Was it?" "The tomatoes needed company." Grace was already almost certain she liked this child. Cut. They walked the grounds for an hour and a half. The apple orchard was at its tail end of the season. Most of the fruit already harvested, a few late stragglers still hanging in the upper branches, the ones nobody had reached. The trees were old, gnarled, in the specific beautiful way of trees that had been doing their work for decades without anyone's assistance, and the light through the half-bare branches turned everything gold and slightly unreal. Grace walked slowly between the rows with her notebook. Ethan walked beside her and told her what he knew about the varieties, which was actually quite a lot. He'd grown up reading about horticulture, he said, in the distracted way people mention things they love when they're not performing the loving of them. His late wife had planted the quince. He said it simply, with no build-up, just a factual thread of the orchard's history. Grace didn't press it. "She had good instincts," she said. "She did," he said. They moved on. The quince bushes along the eastern fence were extraordinary, heavy with their knobby, yellow-green fruit, aromatic even in the October cold. Grace picked one with Ethan's permission, held it to her nose, turned it in her hands. The smell of raw quince was astringent and strange, almost medicinal, nothing like what it became when you cooked it. She'd always thought that was one of the more honest things about quince. It didn't pretend to be something easy. You had to work with it to get to the good part. "I'm thinking a tart," she said, half to herself. Slow-roasted quince, something with honey and cardamom, good pastry, not fussy pastry, the kind that actually flakes, and the apples. She looked back at the orchard. Caramelized, maybe, or raw sliced on top of something that's cooked, for contrast. People don't expect the contrast. "They don't," Ethan said. She looked over at him. He was looking at the quince she was still turning in her hands, but his expression was somewhere else for a moment, in some other year. Lily, who had been crouching over something interesting near the fence post, stood up and came over. "What does it taste like?" she asked, looking at the quince. "Raw? Terrible," Grace said. Lily wrinkled her nose. "Then why do you want it?" "Because it becomes something different when you cook it. It turns pink, almost, and the flavor gets complicated and sweet, but still a little sour at the edges." She handed it to Lily, who turned it over the same way Grace had. Some things need heat to become what they're supposed to be. Lily stared at the quince with great seriousness. Then she handed it back and said, "Okay, I think you should put it in the tart." "Yeah?" Grace said. "Good to know." "I have good taste," Lily said. "Dad says so." "Dad's right," Grace agreed. Ethan was not suppressing a laugh this time. He just let it happen. Mom. She came back to the estate 6 more times over the following 3 weeks. It didn't start out that way. The first 2 visits were strictly the contract work, finalizing the concept, testing recipes in the kitchen, working out the quantities and the sourcing. She brought her own equipment, the specific things she trusted, her bench scraper, her pastry brushes, the offset spatula that was too old to be professionally advisable, but that fit her hand perfectly. She spread out on the center island and worked for 5 or 6 hours at a stretch, and the kitchen absorbed her the way good kitchens did, without fuss, just space and reliable heat. The third visit, Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway at noon and said, "Have you eaten anything today?" She had been going to eat the test slice of tart that was cooling on the rack. That counted. "Not in the traditional sense," she said. "He made sandwiches. Not from ceremony. Just moved to the refrigerator with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had decided a thing and was doing it. They ate standing at the counter because that was where they both were. And he asked her about the tasting notes she'd been keeping, and she talked through the quince batch that had been disappointing and why. and he asked questions that were actually useful questions rather than the decorative kind people asked when they wanted to seem interested. "The heat has to be low and slow," she said. "You push it, and the texture goes wrong. It sort of collapses into itself instead of holding structure." She gestured with her sandwich in a way that was probably not precise, but that he seemed to follow. "You lose the thing that makes it interesting." "The thing at the edges," he said. She looked at him. "The sour at the edges," he said. "The part that's still a little difficult even after all the cooking." She was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," she said. "That's the part worth keeping." He looked at his sandwich. She looked at her tart. The kitchen hummed quietly around them. The fourth visit, Lily was home from school early because of a half day, and she sat at the kitchen island doing homework with the specific theatrical suffering of a 7-year-old who believed homework was a personal injustice. Grace worked around her. Lily, despite the theatrical suffering, kept looking up at what Grace was doing with the restrained fascination of someone trying not to seem too interested. "What's that?" she finally asked, pointing at the small pot on the stove. "Cardamom syrup." "What does cardamom smell like?" "Come here." Lily climbed down from the stool and came around the island. Grace held the spoon over the pot and let the steam rise, then tilted the spoon toward Lily without getting it anywhere near her face. The smell drifted up, warm and complex, floral and slightly sharp. Lily's eyes went wide. "It smells like Christmas," she said. "Or autumn," Grace said. "Depends what you're making." "What are we making?" "We." Grace registered it without making anything of it. "A syrup for the tart glaze. It'll keep the pastry from going soft, but it'll also add another layer of flavor underneath the quince." "Can I stir it?" "Not yet. It's too hot." She handed Lily a clean wooden spoon. "You can stir the one that's cooling over there." Lily crossed to the indicated bowl with the grave responsibility of someone who had been given an important assignment. She stirred very carefully, with both hands, watching the spoon move through the cooling syrup. "Is this part of the recipe?" she asked. "Sure," Grace said. Ethan, who had come in from his studies sometime in the last 10 minutes and was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, caught Grace's eye over Lily's head. She looked away first. The fifth visit, she arrived to find that the refrigeration on the left side of the undercounter units had stopped working overnight. This was the practical catastrophe, it sounds like. She had 2 test batches stored in there, components for Thursday's full run-through, things she couldn't easily replace on short notice. She stood in front of the open unit at 8:45 in the morning and assessed the damage with the methodical calm of someone who had been in kitchens long enough to know that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Ethan appeared behind her. "I just found out. I'm so sorry. The repair service can't come until Friday." "Can the components from the right unit be consolidated to make room?" "Probably. Let me—" He moved past her, opened the right unit, started shifting things. She moved in beside him. They worked in the efficient shoulder-to-shoulder rhythm of 2 people solving a specific problem with a specific deadline. No ceremony about it, just the practical dance of the kitchen where the only authority was what needed to be done. 20 minutes later, everything was transferred. Grace was kneeling on the floor relabeling containers with a marker. Ethan was on his feet doing the same at the upper shelf. The kitchen was slightly chaotic, boxes on the counter, her notes spread across the island, and the morning light was coming through the window at an angle that made everything look dustier than it was. "I can work around it," she said. "I'll adjust the schedule. It's fine." "It's not fine," he said. "It's my fault for not catching it sooner." "You can't monitor every appliance in the building at once." "I'm supposed to have a system for that." She stood up from the floor. He was still at the upper shelf. At this proximity, she was aware that the pull in his sweater, not the same one as the first meeting, a different one, but also with a small pull near the collar, was still there, which meant he either didn't notice such things or didn't consider them worth addressing. She found she had no opinion on which it was, except that it made him look less like a billionaire and more like a person, and she had been finding him more and more like a person with each visit. "It's fine," she said again. "I mean it." He looked at her. He was close enough that she could see the particular tiredness around his eyes that had been there since the 3rd visit, and that she was increasingly sure was not just today's tiredness. It was older than that. The settled-in kind. Thank you, he said, for not making it into a bigger thing than it is. I don't make things into bigger things than they are, she said. Usually. Is that true? She thought about it honestly. No, she said. Sometimes I make things into smaller things than they are. Probably more often. He looked at her for a moment longer than a moment. Me too, he said. They went back to work. The festival was 12 days out when the call came from Patrice. Grace was in the bakery. It was a Tuesday morning, bread day, and she had 5 loaves in the oven and her hands in the next batch, when Patrice came through from the front looking like something had landed on her that she hadn't prepared for. Jimmy's Dessert Cafe opened early, she said. Grace looked up. He's open. Signs lit. He's got a sandwich board out front with a special. Patrice sat down in the chair by the back wall that existed specifically for when she needed to sit down and think. They're underpricing everything. Everything, Grace. His croissants are half what we charge. Grace was still for a moment. His croissants are not as good. I know they're not, but they're cheaper, and they're right there, and people are going in. Patrice rubbed her face. We need the festival income. I know. We need it more than I said we needed it. Grace looked at her. How much more? The oven. Patrice exhaled. The back oven gave out yesterday after you left, completely out. Repair's going to be $3,500, and they can't come until next Thursday. Next Thursday was 2 days after the Harvest Festival. The math was very clear and very bad. The Festival Commission will cover the repair, Grace said. If everything goes right, everything will go right. Patrice looked at her with the specific love of a woman who had watched Grace say everything will go right and then go home and worry at the ceiling for 3 hours. It has to. It will, Grace said. Not as a comfort. As a statement of fact she was going to make true through whatever means necessary. She drove to the estate that afternoon, not a scheduled visit. She hadn't called ahead. She just needed to see the kitchen, to walk the timeline in her head again, to make the numbers work out in the physical space where they had to actually happen. Cole let her in. He'd gotten used to her by now, had stopped doing the formal escort routine and just pointed at the kitchen. She was 20 minutes into recalculating the production schedule when she heard small feet on the tile and turned to find Lily standing in the doorway, still in her school uniform, backpack on, with the expression of someone who had come to find a specific person and had found them. You're here, Lily said. I am. How was school? Okay. She dropped her backpack on the floor near the door. Not near a counter, not in the way she'd learned where things could go, and climbed onto her stool. We did fractions. And? They're annoying. They are. They become useful later. That's what my teacher says. Your teacher and I are right about this one. Lily looked at the spread of Grace's papers on the island. Are you fixing something? Trying to. Is it a kitchen problem? Timing problem. Lily picked up a pencil from somewhere. She always had a pencil, Grace had noticed, tucked somewhere on her person, and held it like she was considering the notes. What's the timing problem? Grace hesitated, but Lily was 7, not 4, and she looked at the notes with genuine attention. I have too many things to make and not enough hours to make them all, Grace said. So I'm trying to figure out which things can happen at the same time and which things have to wait. Like traffic, Lily said. Grace looked at her. Yeah, exactly like traffic. You need to find where the roads aren't full, Lily said, and use those. She said it simply, easily, the way children sometimes produce perfectly correct answers by applying logic that wasn't cluttered up by everything adults had learned to overthink. Grace looked at her schedule, looked at it again with different eyes. You're right, she said. Lily looked pleased but contained about it. Fractions might be useful, she said, but traffic I already understood. Grace laughed, a real one, the surprised kind, and started redrawing the timeline. Ethan found them there 40 minutes later. Grace at the island with her papers reorganized into something that actually worked, Lily on her stool pretending to do homework, but primarily watching Grace's hands. He stood in the doorway for a moment without saying anything. Then he said, Should I make sandwiches? Yes, Grace said, without looking up. Peanut butter, Lily said. I know what you want. I'm just making sure you know. He came into the kitchen, and the three of them occupied the space with the easy, uncrowded comfort of people who had, without deciding to, gotten used to each other. Lily worked on fractions. Grace worked on the schedule. Ethan made sandwiches and didn't ask what the problem was or whether he could help with it, just made himself useful in the background in the particular way of someone who understood that help didn't always mean inserting yourself. When the sandwiches were done, he slid one to Grace's side of the island. She ate half of it while still writing. He watched her do this with an expression she caught in her peripheral vision, but didn't look at directly because she wasn't sure she wanted to know what it was. They ate. The kitchen held them. I think I have it, Grace said eventually, tapping the end of her pen against the reorganized schedule. The traffic? Lily asked. The traffic, Grace said. Lily held up her hand in the unselfconscious way of children who hadn't decided high fives were uncool yet. Grace high-fived her. Ethan watched this and said nothing, and the expression she hadn't looked at directly was still there, and it was not complicated once she finally glanced at it. It was simply a man watching two people he cared about in a kitchen that had been too quiet for too long, and feeling the particular weight of something he hadn't let himself name yet. Grace filed it away carefully. Not for use. Just because it was true, and true things deserved to be kept somewhere. 3 days before the festival, everything went sideways. It started with a phone call at 6 a.m. from the catering coordinator, a different one, not Melissa, someone who'd been brought in specifically for the festival, informing Grace that the refrigerated transport unit that was supposed to deliver the pre-made components to the estate had been involved in a minor accident overnight and was out of commission. The components were fine, undamaged. The unit was not. And the backup unit the company was offering had a temperature issue that made it inappropriate for pastry transport. Everything Grace had already made. Everything she'd sent to the commercial cold storage 2 days before to free up the estate kitchen for the final push. She sat in the bakery at 6:07 in the morning and looked at the problem. Then she called Ethan. He answered on the second ring, which meant he was already awake, which meant she was not the first crisis of his morning. I heard, he said. Coordinator called me too. Okay? She was already pulling up her notes. Here's what I can remake. Here's what I can't. And here's what I can replace with something simpler that serves the same function on the menu. She walked him through it. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated, and when she was done, he said, What do you need? Your kitchen. Mine's too small and the back oven is still down. You have it. What else? Time. 40 hours, give or take. I can do it. I'll work through the night if I have to, but I need to start today. A pause. I'll help. She almost laughed. Ethan, I know I'm not a baker, he said, and his voice was completely level. I know I'll be in the way if I try to do anything technical, but I can carry things and wash dishes and make sure you eat something and keep Lily out of the kitchen when she needs to be out of the kitchen. Another pause. Let me help. She looked at the wall of the bakery, at the fluorescent light that flickered, at the handwritten menu board Patrice had updated 3 days ago in her neat, permanent cursive. 6 o'clock tonight, she said. Bring comfortable shoes. He was there at 5:47. He had, in fact, brought comfortable shoes, worn-in boots, dark jeans, a flannel over a plain shirt, and the look of someone who had cleared the next 40 hours from whatever a billionaire's schedule contained and intended to be present for all of them. He had also, Grace noticed, put a portable speaker on the counter without asking about it, which she found she didn't mind. The first 3 hours were technical and focused. Grace did not have space in her head for conversation. She was running 2 timelines simultaneously, the oven schedule mapped in her brain like a circuit diagram, her hands moving through tasks in a sequence that didn't allow for interruption. She gave Ethan instructions and he followed them without editorial comment. Wash that bowl, pass me the cold butter, don't touch that tray yet. It's still setting, yes, that container, move it to the left shelf. He did every task exactly as she said and asked for clarification when he wasn't sure and never assumed. Around 9 o'clock, when the first major push had moved through and the kitchen was in the steady rhythm of things being monitored rather than actively worked, she leaned against the counter and drank water and looked at the spread of what they'd accomplished. You're a good kitchen assistant, she said. He was washing a bowl. I follow instructions. Most people don't, actually. They think they know better. He glanced over his shoulder. Do you get that a lot? Every catering event I've ever done, someone always knows better about something. Did you ever just let them find out they didn't? Once, she said. The fondant situation of 2021, which I am not describing. He turned back to the bowl with a sound that might have been a laugh. Fair enough. Lily appeared at the kitchen doorway at 9:30, in pajamas, with the careful nonchalance of someone who had not been sneaking down the hall. I woke up, she said. I know, Ethan said without turning around. I was just checking on the progress. From bed. From the hall. Grace said without looking up from the pastry she was working on. The quince tarts are going in the oven in about 15 minutes if you want to smell them before you go back to sleep. There was a pause. I can wait 15 minutes, Lily said. You can sit on the stool, Grace said. Don't touch anything. Lily sat on her stool with the contained dignity of someone who had won a small but meaningful negotiation. The tarts went in at 9:47. At 10:02, the smell of roasting quince and cardamom and good butter pastry moved through the kitchen with the particular warmth of something that had been worth the effort, and Lily closed her eyes and breathed it in. Christmas and autumn, she said quietly. Yeah, Grace said. Ethan was standing at the sink. He didn't say anything, but he stood there for a moment with his hands still and his head slightly bent and his face doing the complicated thing it did sometimes when he was somewhere else and also very much here. Lily went back to bed at 10:20, satisfied. Ethan and Grace worked through the rest of the night, taking turns monitoring the oven, swapping tasks without keeping score, operating in the easy economy of two people working toward the same thing with enough trust in each other to not have to narrate it. At 2 a.m., he made coffee. At 3:30, she made him try a test piece of the apple tart, and he said it was perfect, and she said nothing was perfect. What did he actually taste? And he said the pastry was slightly undersalted on the right side, and she looked at it for a moment and said, Huh, you're right. He looked quietly pleased about that, in the way that wasn't about being right. At 5 a.m., with the last trays in their proper places and the kitchen clean to Grace's standards, they stood on opposite sides of the center island and looked at what 40 hours of work, mostly Grace's, honestly, but meaningfully his, had produced. It was good, better than good. You should sleep, she said. So should you. I'm going to. I'm driving home. He looked at her. You're not driving home at 5 in the morning after working through the night. I have the bakery to open at... Patrice can open the bakery. He said it with the quiet certainty of someone who had thought about this. There's a guest room. It has a bed in it. You can sleep for 4 hours and get back before anyone needs you. Grace looked at him across the island. The kitchen was quiet around them, the orange light of early morning beginning at the window. They were both tired in the particular way that comes after sustained effort, the kind of tired that strips away the social performance of things and leaves you with whatever is actually there. Ethan, she said. It's a room with a bed, he said, and a door that locks if that's what you need. I'm not trying to make this into anything it isn't. I just don't want you driving on no sleep. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back, and his face was exactly what it always was, direct and tired and present and not performing anything at all. 4 hours, she said. 4 hours. She slept for 4.5, in a room with good curtains and a bed that was the best she'd slept in years, and she lay there for 30 seconds after waking and looked at the ceiling and let herself feel, plainly and without trying to minimize it, that something had shifted. Not into anything defined, not into anything that had a clear shape or a name. Just shifted. Like something that had been locked for a long time turning, not yet open, but no longer entirely closed. She got up, washed her face in the attached bathroom, went downstairs to find coffee made and a note on the counter in handwriting that was slightly worse than she'd expected from someone who seemed precise about everything else. Festival starts at 10. You have time. E. Below it, in smaller, shakier, clearly a child's writing, the tarts are going to be the best thing there. L. Grace stood in the kitchen holding the note for a moment. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her jacket pocket. She drove home in the early morning with the window down slightly, the cold air doing what coffee hadn't quite finished, and the note against her chest, and the awareness that 3 weeks ago she had driven up this same road thinking about Quince and a contract and saving a bakery. She was still thinking about those things. She was thinking about other things too. The Harvest Festival was, by any reasonable measure, a success. Grace knew it from the first hour. The specific way the serving tables held up under actual crowd pressure, the way the quince tarts disappeared faster than she'd scheduled for, and she'd had to pull the backup trays earlier than planned, the way people stood in front of the centerpiece display with their phones out, taking photographs of food in the particular reverent way that meant something had landed. She knew it from the coordinator circling back to her 3 separate times with compliments from guests. She knew it from the look on Patrice's face when Grace texted her a photo of the empty tart trays at 1 p.m. Patrice texted back a single word. Finally. It was the most emotional Grace had ever seen her communicate in text form. The estate looked good in the autumn light. The grounds managed the transition from private to public event with the ease of a place that had been doing this for years, the harvest decorations working with the natural decay of the season rather than against it. The apple trees in the orchard stripped down now, but still beautiful in the skeletal way of things that had done their work honestly. Grace moved between the dessert stations all morning in the focused half-trance of someone running an event, monitoring temperatures and replenishing displays and redirecting the 2 assistants she'd borrowed from a catering company. Her attention split across 12 things simultaneously in the way that had become her professional normal. She barely saw Ethan for the first 4 hours. She was aware of him, in the peripheral way she'd gotten used to over the past 3 weeks. The way you become aware of a person's presence in a space without having to look directly at them. He was hosting, moving through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who had done this enough times that it no longer cost him anything visible, shaking hands, saying the right things, occasionally glancing in her direction from across the grounds, with an expression she'd learned to read as a kind of quiet check-in. She was all right. She was more than all right. She was running on 4.5 hours of sleep and 37 hours of cumulative preparation and an amount of coffee that Patrice would have called irresponsible. And she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to do. Lily found her at the dessert station around noon, eating a piece of apple tart with the focused attention of a professional taster. "Well?" Grace asked. Lily chewed, considered. "The pastry is better than yesterday. Rested it good overnight." "Is that a thing?" "Pastry likes to rest, better texture." Lily nodded like she was filing this away. She was wearing a deep red sweater and her hair was down today, which meant she'd had opinions about the braid this morning and won the argument. "Dad said you were here until 5 in the morning. About that." "He was too." "I know." Lily looked at her apple tart. "He doesn't usually do that." "Do what?" "Stay up." She picked at the edge of the pastry. "He works late sometimes, but usually in his study. He doesn't usually—" She paused, searching for the word with the slightly frustrated precision of a child who knows exactly what she means and doesn't have the vocabulary for it yet. "He doesn't usually come down to where things are happening. He just stays up where it's quiet." Grace looked at the tart trays, checked the temperature of the display, looked at the tart trays again. "The kitchen needed extra hands," she said. "Yeah," Lily said. She didn't sound like she was arguing. She sounded like she was putting something together and had gotten to the end of it. "I know." She finished her tart and wandered back into the crowd, and Grace watched her go with the specific feeling of a person who has been seen more clearly than they expected by someone they hadn't expected to see them clearly. Sad. The trouble started, as trouble often does, in a conversation Grace wasn't part of. She found out about it sideways, the way you find out about most of the things that are being said about you, which is by accident, at the wrong time, without any of the context that might have made it easier to hear. It was after 2 o'clock, the festival at its afternoon peak, and Grace had slipped inside the main house to use the restroom near the service corridor, the one she knew the location of from her weeks of kitchen visits, not the public restrooms near the garden. The corridor was empty. She was coming back toward the kitchen when she heard voices from the small sitting room whose door was cracked open, and she almost kept walking, would have kept walking, except that she heard her own name. She stopped. She knew she should keep walking. She knew everything about what she was about to do was the wrong choice, that nothing good ever came from standing in hallways listening to cracked doors, that the version of this where she learned something useful was considerably less likely than the version where she learned something that would sit in her chest for a long time. She stood there anyway. There were two voices. She recognized one, Claire Whitmore, Daniel's sister. She'd seen her at the wedding, had not spoken to her, had known her vaguely from the years of being with Daniel in the way you know the peripheral people around someone. Well enough to recognize, not well enough to trust. She didn't recognize the second voice, a woman, older from the sound of it, with the particular cadence of someone who was used to being listened to. "Doesn't surprise me," the second voice was saying. "He's always done this. The foundation work, the charity events, all of it. There's a brand to maintain." "It's not just charity work this time," Claire said. Her voice had the quality of someone reporting news they were too pleased about. "He's been seen with her on the grounds half a dozen times. Brought her in for this festival. The baker." "The baker." A pause that had something unpleasant in it. "She works at that little bakery on Clement Street, the one that's been on the verge of closing for 2 years. Patrice something. Ethan gave her this massive contract. Of course he did. And now she's here running the whole dessert operation, and apparently Lily is completely taken with her, and he's been spending his evenings in the kitchen." "Because it makes him look accessible," the second voice said. It was smooth, certain, the voice of someone who had made up their mind about something years ago and was done being talked out of it. "It's very good optics. Billionaire mentors struggling local businesswoman, gives her a platform, she's grateful. He looks generous. It works." "You think that's all it is?" "What else would it be?" A short pause. "Look at where she comes from. Look at where he comes from. That doesn't happen, Claire. Not really. Not outside of stories people tell themselves. She doesn't seem like... she's not stupid. She seems like she knows exactly what she's doing." "I'm sure she does," the second voice said. "I'm sure she's very competent. That doesn't mean she has any idea what she's actually part of." The conversation shifted to something else. Grace had already stopped listening. She walked back down the corridor to the kitchen. She stood at the center island with both hands flat on the cool surface and breathed out slowly and looked at the wall. The thing about old wounds, the specific thing that made them different from fresh ones, was the way they made you fluent in a particular kind of pain. You didn't have to learn it again from scratch. You recognized it immediately, the weight and the shape of it, the way it moved through you. And because you recognized it, it was faster. It didn't have to work its way in. It already knew the door, because it makes him look accessible. It's very good optics. She thought about the phone call 3 days after the wedding, the way he'd said, "I found out afterward that you made the cake," the Instagram comment. "I do, actually, working on it." The commission that had saved the bakery from the water bill and the broken oven and Jimmy's competing croissants. The fact that he had specifically, personally sought out a struggling baker from a bakery on the verge of closing and handed her a contract that solved most of her immediate problems. She thought about his daughter and how quickly Lily had attached herself to Grace, and how useful that attachment was if what you were building was an image of warmth and community and connection to the working world outside your estate gates. She thought about the hand on her waist in the garden, which she had filed away carefully, and took it back out now and looked at it differently. She was good at this, she realized, at taking the things she'd started to believe and dismantling them with the efficient patience of someone who had been wrong before and knew the cost of it. Daniel had said, "I need someone more put together." He had been explaining that she didn't fit, that she was insufficient in the ways that counted for his life, which was built on surfaces and presentation and the correct amount of polish. Ethan Blackwood needed evidently the opposite. He needed the absence of polish, the struggling bakery, the visible need. It made him look generous and real and connected, and she had walked right into it with her flour-dusted hands and her $40 dress and her notebook full of quince notes, and she had felt, for the first time in years, like the right amount of herself in the right place, which was the most expensive kind of wrong you could be. She pushed off the counter, went back to her dessert stations, served the afternoon crowd with the professional calm she had always been capable of, regardless of what was happening underneath it. She smiled at guests who complimented the food. She answered the coordinator's questions. She replenished the apple tart trays and managed the last 2 hours of the festival without anything visible going wrong. When Ethan found her near the end of the afternoon, the crowd thinning, the golden October light going sideways through the trees, she was packing up the last of her equipment. It was extraordinary, he said. He meant it. She could always tell when he meant something. The tart alone is going to be talked about for months. Good, she said. Her voice was level. She kept her hands busy with the packaging. He paused. She could feel him reading the air. You okay? He said. Tired, she said. Long 2 days. Right. Another pause. There's dinner, if you want to stay. Cole is setting up inside. Nothing formal, just the staff and a few people. She looked up at him. He looked exactly the same as he always did, which was part of the problem. Direct and tired and present, the flannel from the night kitchen replaced by a proper jacket for the event, but still with that quality of saying exactly what he meant rather than what he was supposed to say. Or that was what she'd thought. I should get back, she said. The bakery's open tomorrow and I need to be functional. Of course. He accepted it without pushing. Another thing she had cataloged as a virtue and was now looking at from a different angle. The remainder of your fee will be transferred Monday. She nodded. Thank you. She finished packing. He helped, the same way he'd helped with the dishes and the boxes and everything else over the past weeks. Without ceremony, just usefully present. She didn't say anything about the hallway conversation. She didn't say anything about optics or brand maintenance or what made a billionaire look accessible. She said, take care, Ethan. Same words as in the garden, 6 weeks ago, different weight. He was looking at her when she said it, and something in his face shifted. Not all the way into anything specific, but moved. Like he'd noticed the distance and didn't know what it was yet. She didn't explain it. She got in her car, missed the turn, drove home. But the following 2 weeks had the particular texture of things returning to normal in ways that were mostly fine and occasionally not. The bakery was still there. The oven was repaired on Thursday, as scheduled, and Patrice stood in front of it for a full minute after the repair crew left with the expression of someone who had received very good news and was letting it settle. The water bill was paid. Jimmy's dessert cafe was still undercutting them on croissants, but the festival had generated enough social media coverage. The quince tart, specifically, photographed approximately 400 times by Grace's count, that the bakery had seen a genuine uptick in customers in the 2 weeks following. The bakery that made those tarts from the Callaway Harvest Festival was a thing people were saying. Patrice put a small sign in the window. Grace told her it was excessive. Patrice kept the sign. Grace worked. She shaped bread and piped buttercream and managed the holiday order list that had started coming in earlier than usual this year. And she did all of this with the competence and focus that had always been her most reliable quality. She did not think about Ethan Blackwood. She was somewhat successful at this. She did not think about Lily. She was less successful at this. Lily was an easier problem to examine because there was no ambiguity in what Grace felt about her. She had liked that kid from the moment the kid had told the florist her roses were very brave. The attachment had been easy and uncomplicated, and it had simply happened, the way some things did, not because Grace had gone looking for it, but because Lily had walked into the kitchen and sat on her stool and stirred the cooling syrup and been exactly who she was, which was a small, sharp, completely unsentimental person who gave her affection in the way she gave her opinions. Directly, without performance, take it or leave it. Grace had taken it. She missed it now in the low-grade way you miss things that turned out to matter more than you'd realized while they were happening. But the thing about the voice in the hallway, the smooth, certain voice saying what else would it be, was that it didn't just apply to Ethan. It applied to everything. It made Grace look at Lily's attachment and wonder if that too was something Ethan had cultivated, consciously or not. A daughter who bonded quickly with the woman he'd brought into the house. A child who was easy to love, who made the picture complete. She knew, in the rational part of herself, that this was unfair to Lily. That Lily was 7 years old and incapable of being anyone's strategic asset. But the voice in the hallway had gotten into the part of her that wasn't rational, which was the part that had always been the most vulnerable. The part that had believed Daniel's "I need someone more put together" was a reflection of his shortcomings when it was actually just true. The part that had decided somewhere along the line that her own judgment about who to trust was not reliable. She was 30 years old, and she did not entirely trust herself. That was the plain fact of it. She'd been wrong before about big things, and wrong in ways that had cost her, and the debt of those mistakes had shaped her into someone who kept a slight distance between herself and the things she wanted most, because the closer you got, the more it cost when it turned out you'd been wrong again. Chad. She was in the middle of a complicated custom order, a 6-layer birthday cake with a specific filling situation that required her full attention. When the door to the bakery opened and a woman she didn't recognize came in. The woman was in her mid-40s, polished in the specific way of someone who had been at an expensive wedding recently, because Grace realized, she'd seen her at the Whitmore reception, in the 3rd row with a glass of champagne and an expression of enjoying herself thoroughly. She was not Claire Whitmore. She was someone from that world, which immediately made Grace's internal temperature drop a couple of degrees. "Are you Grace Holloway?" the woman asked. "I am," Grace said. Her hands kept working because the filling didn't wait. "I'm Diane Ashworth. I'm on the board of the Blackwood Foundation." She said it with the tone of someone who expected the name to land. "I was at the Harvest Festival. I remember seeing you at the Whitmore wedding," Grace said, because she remembered exactly who had been where. Diane Ashworth smiled, a quick, assessing thing. "Sharp. Good." She looked around the bakery with the careful neutrality of someone trying not to show what they thought about a small place. "I'll be brief, because I can see you're working. I wanted to compliment you on the festival desserts. They were genuinely outstanding." "Thank you." "Ethan clearly has an eye for finding hidden talent." She said it warmly, pleasantly. "He does this periodically. The foundation is really quite remarkable in the way it identifies people who just need a platform." Grace stopped working. She set down the spatula. She turned to look at Diane Ashworth fully, in the way that she didn't usually look at people, without the deflection, without the polite slide away. "The foundation," she said. "The Blackwood Foundation, yes. It's Ethan's primary philanthropic vehicle. He's very committed to supporting—" Diane's voice stayed warm, pleasant, entirely unsuspecting of what she was walking into. "Small local businesses, emerging talent, community initiatives. Your bakery fits the profile quite well. The Harvest Festival contract was exactly the sort of thing the foundation was designed to enable." The bakery was very quiet. Patrice had gone to the bank. The one counter assistant, a part-time college student named Wren, was on her break. It was just Grace and Diane Ashworth and the unfinished birthday cake and the fluorescent light that still flickered every 20 minutes. "The contract," Grace said, "was for event services." "Of course it was. And I'm sure you delivered them beautifully." Diane smiled again. "I just wanted you to know that the foundation work Ethan does is something he's deeply proud of. You're not the only beneficiary. There are dozens of small businesses he's helped over the years. It's a real legacy." Grace looked at her for a long moment. She thought about 40 hours in a kitchen. She thought about 2 water glasses and a stone bench. She thought about a note in handwriting that was slightly worse than expected. "You have time." And below it, in smaller, shakier letters, "The tarts are going to be the best thing there." She thought about the voice in the hallway. What else would it be? And here, in the plain daylight of her own bakery, with a woman she'd never met being entirely pleasant about it, was the answer, spelled out simply. A foundation. A profile she fit. Dozens of small businesses over the years. She was not special. She was a beneficiary. She was a line item in a philanthropic legacy that Ethan Blackwood was deeply proud of. She picked up her spatula. "Thank you for stopping in," she said. Her voice was completely even. She was proud of that. "Of course." Diane Ashworth moved toward the door, then paused. "He's a good man, you know. He genuinely cares about this work." "I'm sure he does," Grace said. The door closed. Grace stared at the birthday cake. Her hands had stopped moving. That was the thing she noticed. Her hands, which always moved, which had been moving through some task or another since she was 17 years old and first worked in a kitchen, had simply stopped. She put the spatula down on the counter, went through the swinging door to the back, stood by the bread table, put her hands flat on the cool surface the way she had in Ethan's kitchen when things were wrong and she needed a minute to sort herself out. She had been, she thought, very carefully, Over weeks of visits and shared sandwiches and cardamom syrup and 2 water glasses taken by accident. She had been taken in by someone who was practiced and genuine and who probably didn't even experience it as a transaction. Because when you were that wealthy, when helping people was something you did through a foundation with a board and a profile and a legacy, it probably stopped feeling like charity and started feeling like connection. Probably he had liked her. Probably the evenings in the kitchen had been real to him in whatever way they could be real to a person for whom the difference between helping someone and caring about someone had gotten tangled up somewhere along the way. But she had been wrong about Daniel in ways that had seemed obvious in retrospect. And she had come out of that more defended, more careful, more aware of the ways she talked herself into things. She had promised herself she'd be smarter. She had not been smarter. She had simply found a more sophisticated version of the same mistake. The fluorescent light flickered. "Okay," she said. Same word, same voice. The only difference was that this time it felt less like a beginning and more like a door closing. She didn't call Ethan. She didn't go to the estate. She let the text he sent 3 days after the festival. "Hope the recovery week isn't too brutal. The kitchen misses the company." Sit unanswered for a day, then responded with, "All good here. Thank you again for everything." The festival was a great success. Professional, final, appropriate. He replied, "It was. You should be proud." She put her phone down and went back to the bread. Patrice noticed within about 4 days. She didn't say anything immediately. She had the particular discretion of someone who had watched Grace enough to know when to wait. But she watched Grace the way you watch someone who had come back from somewhere slightly wrong, taking inventory of what had changed and what hadn't. On the 6th day, Patrice brought 2 cups of coffee to the back and sat in her chair and handed one to Grace. "The festival man," she said. Grace didn't look up from the pastry she was working. "Patrice?" "I'm just establishing the subject." "The subject is work. We have 12 holiday orders to get through this week." "We'll get through them." Patrice wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "What happened?" "Nothing happened. You went from whatever you were to nothing in about a day. That's not nothing." Grace pressed the pastry dough with more force than it needed. "I clarified something." "What did you clarify?" She told her. All of it. The hallway at the festival, the voice she hadn't recognized. Then Diane Ashworth's visit, the foundation, the profile, the dozens of small businesses over the years. Patrice listened without interrupting, which was one of her better qualities. When Grace was done, Patrice was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. "See? It was a business arrangement, a foundation project. I'm not upset about it." "You don't sound not upset." "I'm fine." "Grace, I made an assumption. I adjusted the assumption. That's how it works." She set down the dough. "It was never going to be anything. I work in a bakery on Clement Street, and he owns an estate and has a foundation with a board. That's not a story. That's a charity case." Patrice looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone who had something to say and was deciding whether the time was right. She apparently decided it wasn't. "Okay," she said again, quietly. They drank their coffee. The bakery was warm and familiar around them, the smell of it exactly what it had always been. The same fluorescent light, the same bread table, the same cracked tile visible through the door to the small bathroom that Grace still hadn't reported to the landlord after 18 months. Everything was exactly the same. Grace drank her coffee and told herself that same was fine. Same was reliable. Same was what she was good at. She almost believed it. 2 weeks after the festival, the phone rang. Not Ethan. She checked and felt immediately irritated with herself for checking and put the phone face down on the counter. It was Cole. His slightly harried voice coming from a number she'd saved under Callaway Estate. Admin for practical reasons. "Miss Holloway, sorry to bother you. I'm trying to reach you on behalf of Mr. Blackwood." A pause. He wanted me to ask if you'd be available for a call sometime this week, just to discuss the possibility of some holiday event work." More work. Of course. Another entry in the Foundation's legacy of small business support. "Tell him I'm fully booked through January," Grace said. She wasn't fully booked through January. She had the capacity. She and Patrice had talked about it just last week. "I'll let him know," Cole said. He sounded very slightly like someone who was delivering a message that surprised him but wasn't his business to question. She hung up, went back to the bread. Her hands moved the way they always moved. Press, turn, fold, press. And the dough did what dough did, and she worked through the morning with the mechanical precision of someone who had been doing this long enough that she didn't have to think about it, which was both a blessing and a problem, because thinking about it would have kept her head occupied. Instead, she thought about Lily stirring the cooling syrup with both hands. She thought about the note on the counter at 5:30 in the morning. She thought about dancing in a dark garden with a man who said, "I'm not sure how I've ended up here," like it was something that had happened to him without his permission, and the way that it felt, and the way she'd filed it away and told herself it was just a moment, and moments were all she'd ever be allowed with people like that. She thought about the voice in the hallway. Not really. Not outside of stories people tell themselves. She pressed the dough, turned it, folded it. Maybe the voice was right. Maybe what she was doing now, the distance, the professional close, the unanswered messages, was the correct move, the self-protective move, the move of a woman who had learned her lesson and was applying it. Or maybe, and this was the thought she kept finding at the end of the others, the one she kept having to put back, maybe she had taken something true and something false and mixed them up so thoroughly that she couldn't tell them apart anymore, and was protecting herself from both in the same motion. She didn't know. That was the honest answer. She did not know. What she knew was bread. The resistance of it, the way it pushed back and then gave, the way it needed time and heat and the right conditions before it became what it was supposed to be. She worked through the morning. She did not call back. She did not go to the estate. She was not, she told herself, hiding. She was just staying in her own kitchen, which had always been where she understood things best, and waiting for some kind of clarity to show up, which was not something you could schedule and not something you could force, and was, in its absence, profoundly frustrating. The bread rose. The oven hummed. The light flickered. The bakery held her the way it always had, imperfectly, familiarly, with the specific comfort of somewhere that asked nothing of her except to show up and do the work. She showed up. She did the work. She was not fine, but she was, as she always was, functional. And in the vocabulary of Grace Holloway's life, functional had always been enough to get to the next thing. She just wasn't entirely sure this time what the next thing was going to be. The thing about grief, real grief, the kind that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but just settles into the architecture of your daily life, was that it looked a lot like ordinary Tuesday mornings. Ethan Blackwood had gotten very good at ordinary Tuesday mornings. He was up at 5:45, same as always, made coffee, checked the overnight emails, reviewed the estate's weekly schedule with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything that required managing rather than feeling. He made Lily's lunch before she was up, turkey and cheese, no mustard, the apple slices separate because she had opinions about apple slices touching other things, and set it on the second shelf of the refrigerator where she could see it. He did all of this in a kitchen that was, objectively, exactly as it had always been. Same appliances, same morning light coming through the east window at the same angle, same faint smell of coffee and old wood that had been part of this kitchen since before he'd owned the estate. The difference was the absence of cardamom. He noticed it the way you noticed any absence. Not all at once, but in the accumulation of small moments where you reached for something that wasn't there anymore. The counter was clear. The center island held only his coffee mug and the morning paper, nothing else. No equipment cases, no notebooks, no spatulas laid out in working order by someone who organized her tools the way soldiers organize their gear, with the practical seriousness of someone who knew the difference between prepared and unprepared. He drank his coffee and read the paper and did not think about this. He was not entirely successful. At that, it had been Cole who told him 3 days after the festival. Not directly, but Cole had delivered messages, not analyses, and had the professional discretion of someone who worked for a private man and knew better than to editorialize. But when Ethan had asked him to follow up with Grace about the holiday event inquiry, and Cole had come back with, she said she's fully booked through January, something in Cole's voice had been slightly off, in a way that Ethan, who had learned to read the people around him through years of necessity, noticed. She said fully booked, Cole confirmed. Is she? Cole hesitated 1/2 second too long. I wouldn't know her schedule, sir. Ethan had sat with that for a while. He had not called her directly after the festival because she had said, "Take care," in a voice that told him something had shifted without telling him what. He knew that voice, not from Grace specifically, but from the general experience of being someone who had enough resources that people sometimes looked at him and recalculated. He'd learned, over years, to give people the space to recalculate, to not push, not insist, to let things settle at whatever distance they needed to settle at. It was a policy that had served him professionally. In his personal life, it had sometimes meant letting things he wanted get far enough away that they couldn't come back. He sent one text. Hope the recovery week isn't too brutal. The kitchen misses the company. Light, easy. The kind of message that gave her room to not answer it in any particular way. She had answered it in the professional way, the final way. He'd read it twice, then set his phone down and gone to his study and spent the rest of the afternoon doing the kind of work that was administrative and thorough and required all the parts of his brain that weren't the part thinking about a woman who put her hands flat on counters when she was working something out. Lily noticed before he admitted anything to himself. She noticed the way children notice things. Not analytically, not with the framework of adult psychology and cause and effect reasoning, but directly. With the blunt accuracy of someone who was still young enough to say what they saw. Is Grace coming back? She asked, 8 days after the festival. They were at the dinner table. Tuesday night, pasta, something Ethan had made without particular inspiration and that Lily was eating without particular complaint, which meant they had both made their peace with adequate. She was hired for the festival, he said. That's done now. Lily looked at him. She had her mother's eyes. The particular quality of them, the way they went still when she was deciding whether the answer she'd been given was the real one. That's not what I asked, she said. Lily. I asked if she's coming back, not why she was here. Ethan looked at his pasta. I don't know. Why don't you know? Because I'm not sure she wants to. Lily was quiet for a moment. She turned her fork in her pasta with the deliberate patience of someone managing their reaction. Did something happen? I don't know what happened, he said honestly. I think something did. Did you ask her? No? Why not? Because... He stopped. The reasons that made sense in his head sounded, out loud to his 7-year-old daughter, like the specific kind of avoidance that he knew, intellectually, was one of his least defensible habits. It's complicated. Dad, Lily set down her fork. She's the first person who's been in this kitchen in a long time who wasn't getting paid to be here. She said it simply, without cruelty, just as a fact she had observed and retained. She stayed because she wanted to be here. I could tell. Ethan looked at his daughter. You're 7, he said. I know what I saw, she said. He didn't argue with that because she was right, and he knew it. And the thing about Lily was that she had inherited from her mother the particular gift of seeing things plainly and saying them the same way. And he had always considered it one of the best things about her, even when it was inconvenient. He didn't call Grace that night, but he thought about it for longer than he had allowed himself to since the festival, and the outline of what he hadn't done well became a little clearer in the dark. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, from the distance Grace had installed, was what had actually happened. He found out from Claire Whitmore, which was not how he would have chosen to find out about anything important, but the universe rarely consulted his preferences on such matters. It was a Thursday afternoon, 3.5 weeks after the festival. He was at a quarterly meeting with his investment advisors in the city, and Claire was leaving the building's lobby restaurant when he came in, one of those coincidences that the city produced with unreasonable frequency, 2 people from overlapping social worlds walking through the same door at the wrong time. She'd had lunch. She looked slightly the way people looked when they'd had a glass of wine with lunch and were carrying something they'd been carrying for a while and hadn't put down yet. Ethan. She stopped. Genuine surprise. I was going to call you. Claire. He hadn't spoken to her since the wedding. He kept his voice neutral. How are you? Fine. She glanced around the lobby, at the people moving through it, and then back at him with the expression of someone making a decision quickly. Can I have 5 minutes? There's something I should have said weeks ago. They sat in the lobby chairs, which was awkward in the way of two people who didn't really sit in the same rooms voluntarily. Claire held her coat in her lap. She looked like someone who had been rehearsing and had just decided to skip the rehearsed version. "After the festival," she said. "I was there. I came with Margaret Ashworth. She's on your foundation board." "I know who Margaret Ashworth is." "She said some things. In the house, during the event. About Grace." She stopped. "And I'd said some things too." Before she started, "I'd been talking to her about Grace, about the contract and all of it, and Margaret built on what I said and made it into something I didn't mean it to be." Ethan was very still. "What did you say?" he asked. Claire's hands moved in her lap, straightening and re-straightening her coat. "I said you'd given her a significant contract, that Lily had gotten attached, that you'd been spending time in the kitchen with her. I said it like, I don't know how I said it, like it was interesting, like it was worth noting." She stopped. "Margaret took it and made it about the foundation, about optics. She said that's what you were doing, said that you were building an image, that Grace was a profile you'd identified, that it wasn't real." Ethan looked at her. "Grace was in the hallway," Claire said. "The door to the sitting room was open. I don't know how much she heard, but—" She stopped again. "I think she heard enough." The lobby noise continued around them, indifferent. Someone was checking into the hotel across the space. A phone rang somewhere. "And Margaret Ashworth visited the bakery," Ethan said. It wasn't a question. Claire's face confirmed it. "She said she was going to compliment her on the desserts. I didn't know she was going to—" She pressed her lips together. "I didn't know exactly what she was going to say, but I think I knew it wasn't just a compliment." Ethan sat back in his chair. The thing that happened in his chest then was not what he would have called simple anger. Anger was there, yes, at Margaret Ashworth, at the particular cruelty of someone with no skin in the game deciding to intervene in something that was none of their business. At Claire for the gossip that had given Margaret the material. But underneath the anger was something more painful and more direct. The picture of Grace standing in a bakery, having had her own judgment confirmed for her in the worst way, rebuilding the wall that he had watched her carefully, tentatively lower, brick by brick, over the past several weeks. He knew about walls. He'd built several himself. He knew how quickly they went back up once you'd been given a reason. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. Claire looked at him steadily. "Because I've been trying to talk myself out of it for 3 weeks, and I haven't been able to." A pause. "Because I don't think Margaret was right, and I think—" She stopped. "You were happy. In a different way than I've seen you in years. Even Daniel noticed it, and Daniel doesn't notice things." Ethan said nothing. "I'm sorry," Claire said. "I know it's late. I should have called the day after the festival." He stood up. "I have a meeting." "I know." He straightened his jacket, looked at her for a moment. "Thank you for telling me." He walked to the elevator, got in, pressed the button for the 14th floor. The doors closed. He stood in the elevator and thought about a woman who made extraordinary things with her hands and kept a note in her jacket pocket and said okay to her own reflection in small bathrooms when the world had not given her much to work with, and who had looked at him across the center island at 5 in the morning with the particular exhausted clarity of someone who had decided, just for that one moment, to stop being defended. He had missed it. He had given her space and let things settle at their own distance, and she had interpreted that silence as confirmation of every worse thing someone else had told her. The elevator reached 14. He had a meeting. He went to it. He sat through an hour and 20 minutes of quarterly projections with the professional composure of someone who had long practice at occupying the correct space, regardless of what was happening in the background. He answered questions. He reviewed numbers. He was present in the ways that were required of him. And at the end of the meeting, when his advisor said, "Any other business?" he said no, and closed his folder and took out his phone. He looked at Grace's contact for a long moment. Then he put the phone away. Not now. Not a call. Not a text. Not another thing she could answer at the professional distance she'd set. He needed to think. He drove home through the city in the early evening traffic, and he thought. What Ethan Blackwood did with difficult things, and he was aware of this, had become aware of it slowly, and with the specific discomfort of self-knowledge that nobody enjoys, was manage them. He was extraordinarily good at managing, at assessing a problem and identifying the correct response and executing it cleanly. His professional life had been built on this capability. His post-grief single parenthood had been sustained by it. The difficulty with managing was that it kept a certain temperature. Things stayed at the temperature of problems being solved rather than the temperature of things being felt. And he had spent enough years at that particular temperature that he'd gotten used to it, the way you got used to a house that ran a little cold. When his wife had died, 3 years ago now, a stroke at 32 that had been preceded by no warning that mattered and followed by no explanation that helped, he had managed it. He had grieved, yes, in the real ways and the private ways, but he had also very rapidly converted the grief into structure, routine, the school schedule, the estate management, the foundation work, the quarterly meetings and the event calendar, and Lily's lunch on the second shelf of the refrigerator where she could see it. He had managed the house back into function and called it healing, and he was not entirely wrong, but he was not entirely right either. Grace had been the first thing in 3 years that he hadn't managed into submission. She had simply showed up, in his garden, in his kitchen, at his center island with her notes and her bench scraper and her absolute uninterest in performing anything for his benefit, and something that had been locked in the managed, efficient, functional part of himself had turned without his permission, the way the quince tart smelled when it came out of the oven, the way some things didn't announce themselves until they were already there. He had given her space because he was afraid. That was the honest answer he reached somewhere on the drive home, somewhere on the stretch of highway where the city gave way to the edge of suburbs, and then the county road, and then the familiar turn. He had given her space because pushing her meant risking something, and he had gotten very comfortable over 3 years of managing with not risking things. He turned into the estate gates, sat in the car for a moment in the dark. Lily was inside with her evening routine. He'd gotten a text from the housekeeper. Homework done, dinner eaten, reading before bed. The estate was lit in the way it was lit at night when he was out. Functional, quiet, the kitchen window warm. He went inside. Lily was in her room, technically reading, but actually in the half-dozed state of someone whose eyes were still on the page, and whose brain had gone somewhere else. He knocked on the open door. She looked up. "Hey," she said. "Hey." He came in, sat on the edge of her bed. "How was school?" "Normal." She looked at him. "Did something happen?" "I found out what happened, with Grace." Lily's eyes went very still. She sat up properly. "What happened?" He told her. Not all of it. She was 7, and the parts about optics and foundation profiles were more adult machinery than she needed. But enough. Someone had said things that weren't true, or that were true in the wrong way, and Grace had heard them, and they'd gotten into the part of her that was already ready to believe them. Lily listened with the focused attention she brought to things that mattered to her. "So she thinks you were just helping her because of charity stuff," she said. "Yes, but that's not why." "No." "Then why don't you tell her?" He looked at his daughter, at the plain, direct face of someone who had not yet learned that there were situations where the obvious answer was harder to execute than it looked. "I'm going to," he said. "When?" "I'm working that out." Lily looked at him with the expression of someone running short on patience. "Dad, you waited 3 weeks already." "I know." "That's a long time for someone to think something wrong." He looked at the bookshelf on the opposite wall. Her mother's books, the ones they'd kept, organized the way she used to organize them by color, and then by size within the color. A system that made no sense alphabetically and perfect sense visually. He and Lily had reorganized them that way when they'd moved into this room, a year after the accident, as a project, a thing to do with their hands on a Saturday. "You're right," he said. "I know." "Okay." Lily settled back into her pillow. "Fix it, Dad." He looked at her. "You're good at fixing things," she said. "That's the thing you're good at. Fix this one." He stood up, pulled the blanket up, kissed the top of her head the way he'd been doing since she was a baby, and that she still hadn't outgrown tolerating. "Good night," he said. "Good night." A pause. "Bring her a cake." "What?" "She brings food when she's trying to say something. Bring her food back." He stood in the doorway. That's your advice. I'm 7. That's my best advice. He turned off her light. He did not bring a cake. He was not, in point of fact, equipped to bring a cake. What he did was drive to Clement Street on a Wednesday morning at 8:15. Not quite opening time, the closed sign still on the bakery door, the lights inside already on because Grace was already there before the sign changed. He sat in the car for 4 minutes. Then he got out. He knocked on the glass door. Waited. The shape of Grace appeared from the back, and he saw the moment she registered who it was. The slight pause in her walk, the flat moment on her face before it went to neutral. She opened the door. She was in her work clothes. Apron, hair pulled back, flower on her left forearm, and a stripe that she hadn't noticed yet. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him across the center island at the end of the 40-hour kitchen push, directly, without deflection, with a tiredness that was specifically not about sleep. "Ethan," she said. "Hi." He looked at her. "Can I come in?" She stepped back from the door. The bakery was warm and smelled the way it always smelled, bread and sugar and the particular yeast and butter undertone that meant someone had been working in here for hours already. He came in and she closed the door, and they stood in the small front space of the shop with the closed sign still in the window. "I talked to Claire Whitmore," he said. Grace's face didn't change, but her hands moved. Just a small thing, a slight adjustment, the way hands moved when someone was deciding whether to keep them still. "She told me about the conversation in the sitting room," he said, "about Margaret Ashworth coming to the bakery." "It doesn't matter," Grace said. "It does. I adjusted my understanding of the situation based on what someone else told you," he said. "Someone who was wrong." Grace looked at him. Her chin was slightly up, not defiant, just the angle of someone who was braced for something and not sure yet whether it was going to be worth it. "Margaret Ashworth is on your foundation board." "She is." "She said the contract was a foundation initiative, that I fit the profile, that you did this." She stopped, chose the next words with the careful precision of someone who had been composing them for weeks. "That helping local businesses was your thing, that there were dozens of them, that I was—" Another stop. "A beneficiary." "Grace, is it true?" she said. "Does the foundation fund contracts like this?" "The foundation funds community initiatives? Yes. The Harvest Festival contract came from my personal accounts, not foundation funds. I made that decision myself, not through any board process, not through any philanthropic framework." He kept his voice level because the levelness was the point. It wasn't a defense, just a correction. "I found out that you'd made that cake. I looked it up. I read everything I could find about you and the bakery. I called. That's it. That's all it was." "But why?" He looked at her. "Because I spent 20 minutes on a garden bench with you, and I wanted to spend more time with you. That's the whole reason." The bakery was very quiet. "That's not—" she started, stopped. "Ethan, that's not—" "I know how it sounds," he said. "I know the gap between my situation and yours is large enough that anything I do looks like charity if you're already looking for it to look like charity. I know Margaret Ashworth is a credible source to you because she has no obvious reason to be wrong." He paused. "But she was wrong, and someone had put it in her head wrong, and I should have been clearer earlier and directly about what I was actually doing. That's on me." Grace was looking at the floor, not evasively. She was thinking. He knew her thinking face now, the particular quality of her stillness when she was working something out rather than just waiting for him to stop talking. "You should have told me," she said finally. "When I asked about the foundation, when Diane Ashworth showed up. I didn't know she'd come here. I didn't know any of it had happened." He stopped. "If you'd called me or answered Cole's call, I would have told you immediately. But you went quiet, and I gave you the space I thought you wanted, and 3 weeks went by." She looked up at him. "You should have pushed." "Maybe," he said. "I don't push, it's a—" He stopped. "I don't push because I've found that people don't like to be pushed, and so I give space, and sometimes the space is wrong and things get too far away to come back. That's my version of the same mistake you made. I let old habits make the decision." She looked at him for a long moment. He had not prepared for what came next, which was her laughing. Not a happy laugh, not a relieved one, just the surprised, slightly helpless laugh of someone who has just recognized something absurd. "We're both idiots," she said. He blinked. "I was going for two people with understandable but incorrect responses to a situation." "That's a long way of saying idiots." "It is," he agreed. The laugh faded. She leaned against the counter and looked at him across the small space of the bakery, and her face was doing the thing it did when she'd stopped managing her expression. Not open exactly, but honest. The real version. "I believed it because I was already ready to," she said. "That's the true thing I have to say about it. It confirmed something I was already afraid of, and I didn't let myself check whether it was real." "I know the feeling," he said. "What were you afraid of?" He looked at her. "That I'd gotten things wrong. That I'd misread. That what I thought was happening between us was one-sided." He paused. "That I was one of those people who convinced themselves they'd made a real connection because they needed one badly enough." Grace was quiet. "I haven't—" He stopped. Started again, because the managed version was wrong here and he knew it. "I haven't let anyone into the kitchen in 3 years. Not like that. I have staff. I have coal. I have people who work here and do their jobs and go home. But Lily is right. She said you stayed because you wanted to be there, and I saw the same thing, and I told myself not to read too much into it because I'm a person who reads too much into things when I need something." "Do you?" she said. "Read too much into things?" "Usually no," he said. "I usually read too little, but with you I was—" He stopped again. The word he landed on was the plain one. "Careful." She held his gaze. "Careful." "More careful than I've been about anything in a while," he said, which probably made me look less interested than I was, which probably didn't help. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the bakery window, Clement Street was doing its morning things. A delivery truck was double parked across the street. Someone was walking a dog with the air of someone who had somewhere to be and had been redirected. The light was the flat gray of November now, no October gold left in it, just the functional light of a city morning getting on with itself. "Ethan," she said, "I'm 30 years old and I work in a bakery and I send $200 a month to my mother in Clarksville because her rent went up and I've been wearing the same dress to every important event for the last 2 years." "I know," he said, "and you own an estate." "I know that too." "Those are real things." "They are. They don't—" She stopped. Tried again. "They don't just disappear because you said something honest." "No," he said. "They don't. They're real, and they stay real." He paused. "But they're not the only real things. And I'd rather be in the kitchen at 5 in the morning with someone who knows how to use an offset spatula than at a dinner with someone who fits the profile better." Grace stared at him. "That's a very specific declaration," she said. "It's a very specific situation." She was quiet. He watched her work through something. He could see it happening, the same way he'd watched her work through the timeline problem with the festival schedule. The same focused patience of someone who was being honest with themselves, even when the honest answer was inconvenient. "I'm not easy," she said finally. "I'm defensive, and I make things smaller than they are, and I assumed the worst about you because it was easier than being wrong again." "I know," he said. "I'm not easy either. I avoid things. I give people so much space I lose them. I've been managing my life instead of living it for 3 years because it was the only way I knew how to keep it from falling apart." He paused. "We're both people who have been wrong before in ways that cost us. That doesn't make us wrong about this." She looked at him for a long time. Her hands were still. She had stopped fidgeting with the apron string she'd been turning between her fingers since he came in. She was just looking at him with the plain directness of someone who had run out of defenses and was standing in the fact of a thing. "I still don't know exactly what this is," she said. "Neither do I," he said. "I'd like to find out." Another long pause. "There's bread in the oven," she said. "It needs to come out in 8 minutes or it burns." "Okay." "You can stay for the bread." He looked at her. "Yeah?" "If you want." "I want," he said. She went through the swinging door to the back. He followed because she'd left it open and stepped into the small back kitchen that smelled of yeast and warmth and the particular aliveness of a place that had been working for hours before the rest of the street was awake. He stood to the side, out of the way, in the space he'd learned over 40 hours in a different kitchen was his correct position, and watched her check the oven with the efficient attention of someone who did this in her sleep, the way her hands went to the oven door with the automatic confidence of 30,000 repetitions. 7 more minutes, she said. I can wait 7 minutes, he said. She glanced at him over her shoulder. Something shifted in her face. Small, not yet anything that had a full name, but the tightness around her eyes was different. The set of her mouth was different. She turned back to the oven and checked the temperature gauge and made a small adjustment with the focus of someone who was going to be competent about this no matter what, which was just how she was, he'd learned, and which was one of the things he let the thought finish. One of the things he loved about her. The word arrived without ceremony, without announcement. Just sat there, quiet and complete, the way things that had always been true felt when you finally let yourself look at them directly. He stood in the small back kitchen of a Clement Street bakery with his hands in his jacket pockets and the smell of bread and morning around him, and the woman who had walked away from a garden a lifetime ago standing 6 feet away, and he felt, for the first time in 3 years, something that was not managed, not structured, not converted into routine and function and the schedule of a house that ran efficiently to keep from falling apart. Just something, present and specific and his. The timer went off. Grace pulled the bread. She set it on the rack and stood back and looked at it the way she always looked at finished things, with the critical assessment of someone who was still figuring out whether it was what she intended. And then she said quietly, to the bread, or possibly to the room, "It's good." "It is," he said. She turned around. They were closer than she'd registered, him having moved slightly toward the rack, her stepping back from it, the small kitchen doing what small kitchens did, which was reduce all distances to the point where nothing could be fully avoided. She looked up at him. He looked at her. "I was wrong," she said, "about what I assumed. I want to say that clearly." "I was wrong too," he said, "about the space, about waiting." "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Grace said, "The bread needs to cool for 20 minutes or the inside won't be set." "I know," he said. He'd been in enough kitchens with her now to actually know this. "I'll wait." "You can make coffee if you want. It's the second shelf. I know." She looked at him. A small thing happened on her face, not quite a smile yet, but the place where one was considering appearing, the same infrastructure he'd seen in the garden 6 weeks ago. "You've been paying attention," she said. "I've been paying attention," he said. She turned back to the bread to check it. He found the coffee. The bakery hummed around them, the ordinary Tuesday morning doing its ordinary things, the bread cooling on the rack in the way bread always cooled, slow and patient and not rushing toward anything. Outside, Clement Street woke up. The closed sign was still in the window. Neither of them changed it for a while. The closed sign stayed in the window for 43 minutes. Grace knew this because she checked the clock when she finally flipped it to open, the way she always checked the clock at opening, a habit built from years of Patrice's mild but consistent disapproval of lateness in either direction. 43 minutes. The bread had cooled. The coffee had been made and mostly drunk. Ethan had washed the 2 mugs without being asked, which she noticed in the way she'd gotten used to noticing the things he did quietly and without announcement. He left before the first customers came in. Not abruptly, not in the way of someone who was managing an exit, but with the natural completion of someone who understood that her morning had its own structure, and he had already taken more of it than she'd planned to give. At the door with his jacket on and the gray November light behind him, he said, "Thursday?" She looked at him. "Thursday what?" "I don't know yet," he said. "Something, lunch, coffee. You tell me what works." She thought about it for approximately 1 second. "The bakery closes at 3 on Thursdays. There's a place on Haverford that has decent soup." 3:15, he said. 3:15, she agreed. He left. She turned the sign to open and went back to the bread and stood at the counter for a moment with her hands flat on the surface and breathed out slowly and let herself feel, plainly, without minimizing it or arguing it down, that something had been returned to her that she hadn't known how to ask for back. It wasn't simple. She knew it wasn't simple. The gap between Clement Street and Callaway Estate was not closed by one honest Wednesday morning in a small bakery kitchen, and she was not naive enough to believe it was. She was still the woman who sent $200 a month to Clarksville and wore the same dress to important events and had chosen years ago to be someone who made things rather than someone things were made for. But she also knew, because she was 30 years old and she'd been wrong before in the useful ways, the ways that taught you something even when they cost you, that the story she'd been telling herself about her own insufficiency was not the same as the truth. Those two things had gotten tangled up in her chest somewhere around Daniel's voicemail and had stayed tangled. And it had taken a man standing in her own kitchen with flour-dusted air between them, saying, "I'd rather be at 5 in the morning with you," to start pulling the threads apart. She wasn't untangled yet. She probably had a while to go, but the threads were moving. That was enough to start with. Cut. Thursday came with rain. Not dramatic rain, just the persistent mid-November kind that made everything damp and gray and required you to make active choices about your mood. Grace closed the bakery at 3, changed out of her work apron into a jacket, and walked to Haverford Street with her hands in her pockets and the rain doing its thing to her hair, which she had not sufficiently prepared for. Ethan was already there when she arrived. He was standing just inside the door of the soup place, not seated, just waiting, in the way of someone who didn't feel comfortable sitting down until the person they were meeting had arrived, which she noted was a small thing, and also not a small thing. He looked at her wet hair. "I have an umbrella in the car," he said. "I didn't know it was going to rain this much." The forecast said 70%. "I don't check the forecast." "I can see that." She looked at him. He looked back with the expression he had when he was being careful about finding something funny. "There's a paper towel in the bathroom if you need it," the woman at the counter offered, unprompted. "Thank you," Grace said. They got soup. They sat at a small table by the window that was slightly wobbly on one leg, and that Ethan fixed by folding a paper napkin and putting it under the short leg without any ceremony about it, which was the kind of practical, unselfconscious thing she'd noticed him do before, and that she found, against most reasonable expectations, somewhat endearing. They talked for 2 hours. Not about anything that required resolution or courage, or not only that. They talked about Lily's ongoing campaign to convince Ethan that a dog would be beneficial to her development, which she had been conducting with the organized persistence of a labor negotiator. They talked about the holiday order season at the bakery, which had accelerated since the festival coverage, and about whether Grace was going to need to hire someone temporarily or just survive it on existing resources. They talked about the estate in winter, which Ethan said was different from the estate in other seasons, in a way he'd never quite figured out how to describe to anyone who hadn't seen it. "Come see it," he said. "In the winter. It's worth seeing." "Is that an invitation?" "It's an obvious invitation, yes." She stirred her soup. "Okay." "Okay," he said. They walked back to the bakery in the rain because her car was parked behind it, and his was in the other direction, and the rain had reduced to a drizzle that was annoying rather than hostile. At the corner he had the umbrella from his car and held it, which required them to walk closer together than the ordinary distance of two people who were still figuring out what they were to each other. At the bakery door she unlocked it and then turned around, and he was right there, close enough that the umbrella was somewhat irrelevant at this point. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I'm still not going to be easy," she said. "I want to be clear about that going in." "I know," he said. "I'm not looking for easy." "I'll assume the worst sometimes," she said. "When I get scared, it's a habit I'm working on, but I'm not cured of it." "I'll give too much space sometimes," he said. "When I get scared, same situation. That's two people who are going to get in their own way repeatedly." "Probably," he agreed. She considered this. "All right," she said. She went inside. He went back to his car in the drizzle without the umbrella, which she realized later he'd left with her, folded and leaning against the inside of the bakery door where she'd find it in the morning. She found it in the morning. She put it in the back and kept it there. December arrived, and with it the specific madness of the holiday season at a bakery that had recently been discovered by the internet. The festival coverage had done something Grace had not entirely anticipated. It had made the bakery real to people outside the 3-block radius who had always known it was there. The quince tarts had been photographed, written about in 2 local food blogs, and mentioned in a broader end-of-year roundup that had nothing to do with Grace specifically, but had named Patrice's as the source of what the writer called the most unexpectedly moving thing I ate all autumn. Patrice had cut out the mention and taped it to the front of the register, where it was slightly wrinkled and not quite straight, and made her tearfully proud every time she looked at it. The holiday orders were, in the most literal sense, more than they could manage with existing resources. Grace hired a part-time baker named Rosario, who was a culinary school dropout with better instincts than half the graduates Grace had ever worked with, and the specific kind of relaxed competence that made a small kitchen feel larger. Rosario started the second week of December and fit into the bakery's rhythm within 3 days, which Grace considered a good sign, because kitchens either accepted you or they didn't, and you could tell by the 3rd day. She told Ethan about Rosario over the phone on a Tuesday evening. They'd started doing this, the phone calls, in the gaps between the in-person time, and Grace had found herself settling into it with the ease of something that had been missing for a while and that fit the space it returned to. "How do you know in 3 days?" he asked. "The way they handle the thing going wrong," she said. "There's always a thing that goes wrong in the first week. Someone drops something, or the oven misbehaves, or a customer is unreasonable. How a person handles the first wrong thing tells you more than anything they do right." "What was Rosario's wrong thing?" "She overproofed a whole batch of croissants on day 2, completely unusable. She looked at them, said, 'Well, that's a Wednesday,' and asked me what we were going to do about it." Grace paused. "Not what she was going to do about it, what we were going to do." "That's the right instinct," he said. "Yeah," she said. "That's when I knew she'd stay." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You do that with people, you know." "Do what?" "Watch for how they handle the wrong thing." A pause. "You did it with me too, at the festival when the refrigeration failed." She hadn't thought about it that way, but he wasn't wrong. She'd been watching, in some background part of herself, from the first moment, watching for the version of him that would appear when something broke, when the situation stopped performing and became just the thing it actually was. "I didn't realize I was doing it," she said. "I know," he said. "That's how I knew it was real." She sat with that for a moment on her end of the phone, in her apartment with the cracked bathroom tile and the secondhand furniture, the November dark outside her window. "How's Lily?" she asked. "Aggressively campaigning for the dog," he said. "She started leaving printed articles about the benefits of childhood pet ownership on my desk." "She printed them out?" "She printed them and stapled them in the corner. There are 6 so far." Grace laughed. "She's going to win." "She knows she's going to win," he said. "That's the most alarming part. She's not worried. She's just building the case for when I need something to point to." Smart kid. "Terrifyingly," he said, with the particular warmth that came into his voice when he talked about his daughter. The uncomplicated, undefended warmth that had been one of the first things she'd noticed about him, that night in a dark garden when he'd said she had opinions about the florals, and meant it as the highest kind of affection. She went to the estate the second Saturday in December. It was cold, properly cold now, the first real cold of the season that meant it, the kind that came in off the coast and made the bare trees look deliberate rather than stripped. She drove up the familiar road and made the turn she now always made correctly, which felt like a small private victory she'd never mentioned to anyone. Ethan met her at the front door with Lily, who was wearing the orange vest again. Apparently it was her primary cold weather layer of choice, and who launched directly into a description of the dog articles without preamble or greeting. "I have 8 now," she said. "One of them has a chart." "A chart," Grace repeated. "About anxiety reduction in school-aged children who have pets." Lily looked at her very seriously. "I'm school-age." "You are," Grace agreed, "and I have anxiety sometimes." "That's very well documented," Grace said. "The chart documents it." Ethan said, "She made the chart herself." "I used the data from the article," Lily clarified. "I just made it look better." Grace looked at Ethan. He had the expression of a man who was going to get a dog and had made his peace with it. The estate in winter was, as he'd said, different. Not worse, different. The grounds had the particular stillness of a place that had let go of its seasonal work and was resting without apology, the trees bare and angular against a sky that was the color of old pewter. The kitchen garden was fully put to sleep now, the beds turned and covered, but there was a structural beauty to the dormancy that Grace hadn't seen in October when everything had still been holding on. It looked, without all its growing, like what it actually was, a well-kept place that knew how to wait. They walked the orchard path after lunch because Lily wanted to, and Ethan agreed to anything Lily wanted that involved being outside, which Grace had observed was a principle he held consistently. The apple trees were entirely bare now, their branches doing their winter architecture, and Lily ran ahead on the path in the way of children who processed the world at a different speed than adults, and didn't see any reason to slow down on their account. "She looks like her mother," Grace said. She said it quietly, not as a question. She'd noticed it before, in the photos in the hallway, the ones she'd passed on kitchen visits without letting herself linger. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Around the eyes," he said, "and the way she moves, the speed of her." She had that same energy? More, actually. Maggie was... He stopped, started again, because he'd decided something. She was a force. Lily is a controlled version. Lily applies it. Maggie just was it, all the time without filter. He looked at the path. Lily got some of my caution, which is either a good thing or I've passed on one of my worse habits. "Maybe both," Grace said. "Probably both," he agreed. They walked in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that didn't need filling. "I don't talk about her much," he said. "To people. I talk to Lily about her, but not to other people." "You don't have to," Grace said. "I know." He paused. "I want to. That's different from having to." Grace looked at him sidelong. He was watching Lily ahead on the path, but his face was the honest version of itself. Not the managed version, not the estate owner version, just a man in a bare apple orchard in December telling the truth about what he wanted. "Then tell me," she said. And he did. Not everything. Not in one walk on a cold Saturday, because grief was not a document you read once, but he told her enough. He told her about the morning it happened, about coming downstairs and finding Lily at the kitchen table eating cereal by herself, too young to understand why no one had come when she called, and about the specific way that image had structured everything that came after. He told her about learning to braid hair badly and getting better at it slowly, and still not as good as Lily would have liked. He told her about the year he'd spent converting his grief into efficiency, and the moment, at a therapy appointment he'd gone to twice and then stopped because he'd decided he was managing. When the therapist had said quietly, "Managing and healing are not the same thing," and he'd thanked her and gone home and not gone back, and had thought about that sentence at least once a week since. "She was right," he said. "Yeah," Grace said, "I know that." "I know you know it." He looked at her. "I'm working on the difference." "Me too," she said. "Different reasons, same project." Lily doubled back at that point to tell them there was a really interesting stick she'd found and she needed a second opinion, and the conversation folded naturally into the business of the stick and the rest of the walk and what was for dinner, and Grace let it fold without trying to hold it open, because some things were better said in motion than in stillness, and what had been said was enough. Christmas came. It came the way it always did, with more noise and obligation than was quite manageable, with Patrice's holly wreath on the bakery door and Rosario's playlist cycling through the same 12 songs on an infinite loop, and the order board so full they'd had to add a second column, and Grace working from 5 a.m. to 7 p.m. every day the week before, and going home to her apartment and eating whatever was fast and sleeping hard and doing it again. Ethan brought food to the bakery on the 23rd. He pulled up in the early afternoon with a bag from a Thai place on Miller Street that Grace had mentioned once, 4 weeks ago, in a Tuesday phone call while she'd been talking about something else entirely. She hadn't expected him to remember. She also wasn't surprised that he had. He came in the back because the front was busy, and also because he knew the back now, the way he knew everything about her working life. Specifically, quietly, without making a production of knowing it. "Eat," he said, putting the bag on the prep table. "I have..." "Rosario has the front," he said. "Eat." She looked at the bag. She'd been running on coffee and the test pieces of things that hadn't quite worked, and one half of a peanut butter sandwich she'd made at 7 this morning and eaten while moving. She ate. He sat across from her on the other stool. Not Lily's stool. Lily's stool was at the estate, but the bakery's version, an old wooden one that wobbled the same way the table at the soup place had wobbled, and drank the coffee she'd poured him, and didn't talk about anything important for 30 minutes. Just the ordinary conversation of two people who had gotten comfortable in each other's everyday. Lily's program is on the 26th, he said, near the end. Grace looked up. The school holiday thing? They do a whole... He made a gesture that communicated theatrical complexity. There are costumes. She's a snowflake. She has feelings about being a snowflake. Good feelings or feelings? She wanted to be a cloud, he said. She was told there were no clouds this year, only snowflakes. She said, and I'm quoting directly, snowflakes are structurally identical to each other, and I don't feel that represents me. Grace put down her fork. She said structurally identical? She's been reading my architecture books. Ethan. I know. She's 7. She's very 7, he agreed. Grace laughed, and it was the laugh she'd been keeping in all week under the holiday rush and the exhaustion, and it felt like something her body had needed and hadn't gotten around to, the way sleep sometimes felt on the other side of not enough of it. Come, he said. The 26th, to the program. She looked at him. If you want, he said. It's not... He stopped, started over. She asked if you were coming. That's the true thing. She asked me last week and I told her I'd ask. Grace was quiet for a moment. She thought about what it meant, going to Lily's school program. What it looked like from the outside. What it meant to Lily, who had been asking in her direct and indirect ways since October whether Grace was coming back. She thought about the things you became when you showed up for someone's child. Not the easy things, not the fun kitchen visits and the high fives and the cardamom syrup and the tarts are going to be the best thing there, but the real weight of it. The thing you couldn't unchoose once you'd chosen it. She thought about how much she wanted to go. Tell her yes, Grace said. He looked at her. Tell her I'll be there, she said, and tell her snowflakes have unique crystalline structures. No two are the same. He was quiet for a beat. That's a good point, he said. I know, she said. Tell her. He told her. Grace found out later, not from Ethan but from Lily herself, who called her on the bakery phone the next morning with the urgency of someone conveying important information, that Lily had used this fact in a follow-up conversation with her teacher and had been allowed to write individual crystalline structure on the back of her snowflake costume in silver marker. I feel better about the costume now, Lily told her. Good, Grace said. Are you really coming? I'm really coming. A pause. Okay. Another pause. Grace? Yeah? I'm glad you're not just the festival person. Grace stood at the bakery counter in the middle of a Tuesday morning with a child's voice in her ear, saying the plainest possible version of a thing that would have taken an adult 20 sentences to get around to, and felt the specific warmth of being seen clearly by someone who didn't have the vocabulary to be anything but direct about it. Me too, Lily, she said. Me too. The holiday program was on a Tuesday evening in a school gymnasium that smelled of floor wax and somebody's forgotten gym bag, and the 200 families who had packed themselves into folding chairs with the cheerful, resigned determination of people who loved their children and were going to sit in these chairs for 90 minutes, regardless of what it cost them. Grace arrived 5 minutes before it started, which was already later than she'd meant to. The bakery had held her with one last thing, as the bakery always did, and found Ethan in the third row from the back, holding a seat with his jacket on the chair beside him. She slid in. He moved the jacket. Their shoulders were close in the packed row. She's backstage, he said quietly. She's been back there for 45 minutes. Nervous? She says she's not nervous. She's been nervous since breakfast. What does nervous Lily look like? Same as regular Lily, but she talks faster and her braid gets tighter. Grace looked at the stage, at the closed curtain with its cheerful holiday decorations, at the teacher in the wing who was doing the controlled panic of someone managing 30 children in costumes. "Thank you for coming," Ethan said. She looked at him. He was looking at the stage. "Of course," she said. He looked at her then. And there was something in his face that was not the managed version, not the professional version, just a man in a school gymnasium in a good jacket sitting next to someone he'd been afraid to want and had found the courage to want anyway, and it was nothing like the grand gesture and everything like the real thing. "I mean it," he said. "Not just for Lily." "I know," she said. The lights went down. The program was exactly what school programs always were. Slightly chaotic, completely sincere, the kind of imperfect that was actually more moving than perfection would have been, because you could see the work in it, the real effort of 30 children trying their best at something in front of everyone they loved. Lily appeared in the third number, a snowflake among 8 other snowflakes, moving with the focused precision of someone who had decided that if she was going to be a snowflake, she was going to be the most intentionally crystalline snowflake this gymnasium had ever witnessed. On the back of her white costume, in silver marker that caught the stage lights, were the words, "Unique Structure." Grace saw it from the third row from the back. She felt Ethan's shoulder against hers and didn't move away. January arrived the way January always did, with the deflation of the holiday rush and the particular exhaustion that comes after sustained effort and the specific quiet of a bakery in the first week of the new year when everyone was on a diet they wouldn't keep and nobody wanted pastry, which Patrice called the annual betrayal, and which Grace used as her week to catch up on the maintenance and reorganization that the fall had run over. It was during this week that she went to the estate with something she'd made at home, not at the bakery. At home, in her own small kitchen, on a Sunday morning when she was off and had time, in the cast iron pan that had been her grandmother's and that she'd carried through 4 apartments because it was the one cooking thing she owned that was irreplaceable, a honey cake. Simple, not elaborate, not a project cake, not a showcase piece, just the thing she made when she wanted to make something honest. The recipe was hers in the way that recipes became yours over time. Originally someone else's, then adjusted and adjusted and adjusted until the original was somewhere at the bottom and what remained was entirely your own. She drove to the estate on a Sunday afternoon with the cake wrapped carefully in the seat beside her, and she made the turn correctly on the first try, and she did not go to the front door. She went to the back. The service entrance, the one that led directly to the kitchen, the one she'd used 100 times over the fall, the one that didn't require going through the main hall or being announced. She knocked. Cole opened it, looked at her, looked at the cake, and said, "I'll get him," with the expression of someone who had been waiting for this particular visit for approximately 3 months. Ethan came to the door in a flannel and jeans, Sunday clothes, home clothes, and saw her standing at his back door with a honey cake, and his face did the thing it did when he was not managing his expression. It just showed her what was there. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. "I made this," she said unnecessarily, holding out the cake. He took it, looked at her. "I owe you an apology," she said. "A real one, not the one I gave in the bakery in November. I believed something that confirmed what I was afraid of instead of asking you directly, and I withdrew, and 3 weeks of something real got lost to it." She paused. "That's on me. Not on Margaret Ashworth, not on the voice in the hallway, not on Daniel or anything that happened before. Me." Another pause. "I'm sorry." He was quiet for a moment, just looking at her. "I should have pushed sooner," he said. "I knew something was wrong and I chose space over showing up, and that was wrong." So, he held her gaze. "I'm sorry too." "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. "Can I come in?" she said. "I'd like to have some of that cake." He stepped back from the door. She came in. It was Lily who said it plainly, as Lily said everything plainly. It was a February afternoon, several weeks after the honey cake visit, several weeks into what Grace had stopped trying to name and had simply accepted as the daily reality of her life, which included Tuesdays at the estate and phone calls on the drive home and Lily's ongoing dog campaign and the comfortable, unsentimental weight of being in 2 places that both felt increasingly like where she was supposed to be. She and Lily were in the kitchen. Ethan was in his study. Lily was not doing homework. She was doing an elaborate construction project with toothpicks and small pieces of dried pasta that Grace had learned not to question, because Lily's projects had internal logic that only became clear at the end. Grace was making a batch of shortbread, not for any order, just because it was cold and she felt like it, and the kitchen had the ingredients and some impulses didn't require more justification than that. Grace, Lily said, without looking up from her pasta structure. Yeah. Do you live here now? Grace looked up from the butter she was cutting. No, I live on Bancroft Street. But you're here a lot. I'm here some. More than some. Lily added a toothpick with careful precision. You're here more than not here. Grace looked at the butter. This was mathematically not quite true yet, but it was more true than it had been 3 months ago, and the trajectory was clear. Does that bother you? Grace asked. Lily looked up at that. She had the expression of someone who had been asked a question they considered completely obvious. No, she said. That's why I said it. I wanted you to know I noticed, and it's okay with me. Grace looked at her. Dad's different when you're here, Lily said. Not different like weird. Different like... She frowned at the toothpick bridge she was building, the slight frustration of searching for language. Like when the heat comes on in winter. You don't notice it's cold until it isn't anymore. Grace set down the butter knife. She didn't trust herself to speak for a moment, so she didn't. Lily, who had the social wisdom to know when something didn't need a response, went back to her pasta structure. Grace went back to the shortbread. They worked in comfortable parallel silence, the kitchen holding them both, the winter light coming through the window at the low angle of February afternoons, the shortbread taking shape under her hands the way things took shape when you'd made them enough times that your hands knew the work without having to be told. When Ethan came in from his study an hour later, drawn by either the smell of shortbread or the particular quality of the silence that meant 2 people he cared about were in a room together, he stopped in the doorway and looked at them. Lily's pasta bridge, which had grown into something ambitious and structurally questionable, and Grace's tray of shortbread, and the ordinary, extraordinary fact of his kitchen being occupied by people who wanted to be in it. His face did the thing, the real thing. Shortbread, he said. 10 more minutes, Grace said. He came in, sat on the stool that was not Lily's stool, but had become, by habit, his stool, put his elbows on the counter, looked at his daughter's architecture project with the assessment of a man who was willing to be curious about toothpick bridges. What is this? He asked. The Brooklyn Bridge, Lily said. The Brooklyn Bridge uses cable suspension, not... It's inspired by the Brooklyn Bridge, Lily said. That's different. I know that's different, Dad. Grace kept her eyes on the oven timer. She was smiling, and she knew it, and she wasn't doing anything about it. The spring wedding at Callaway Estate was booked for the last Saturday of May. Grace found out about it the same way she'd started finding out about everything involving the estate. Not through a formal conversation, but through the natural peripheral awareness of someone whose life had become genuinely entangled with someone else's in the way that happens slowly and then is simply true. Ethan mentioned it in March when he was reviewing the spring calendar. An anniversary couple, married 20 years, renewing vows. Small event. 200 guests. You're not doing desserts, Ethan said. Not a question. I'm not doing desserts, she agreed. I have 3 graduation cakes that week. I wasn't going to ask. I know you weren't. He looked at her. Do you want to come anyway? Not to work, just to... He stopped. It's on a Saturday. If you're free after the graduation cakes. She looked at him. The garden will have its spring things, he said. The quince bushes put out flowers before the fruit. They're... He searched for the word. Unusual. You'd probably find them interesting. You want me to come see the quince flowers? I want you to come, he said. The quince is a reason. She shook her head slightly, not because she was saying no, but because he was, in his slightly awkward, absolutely genuine way, exactly himself. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. Well, the Saturday in May arrived with the specific benevolence of late spring, warm without being hot, the estate grounds in full seasonal effort, the kind of day that made everything look like it knew what it was doing. Grace finished the last graduation cake at noon and drove to the estate in the early afternoon. She made the turn correctly, as she always did now. She went to the back door, as she always did now. The wedding reception was in full setup when she arrived. The estate staff moving through the grounds with the choreographed purpose of people who had done this many times, the flowers going in and the tables going out and the whole beautiful, complicated machinery of someone else's celebration getting assembled in the May sunshine. She found Ethan in the kitchen, reviewing something with Cole, and he looked up when she came in with the particular quality of attention he gave her that she had stopped trying to make herself not notice. "Quince flowers?" she said. "Quince flowers," he confirmed. They walked the grounds while the wedding preparations happened around them, moving through the paths they'd walked in October and December, and the various other seasons that had accumulated between them. The orchard with its spring growth and the kitchen garden already planted with the new season's intentions, and the quince bushes along the eastern fence doing exactly what Ethan had described, covered in small white and pink flowers that were genuinely unusual, slightly strange-looking, not conventionally pretty, but arresting in the specific way of things that didn't bother trying to be anything other than what they were. Grace crouched next to one of the bushes and looked at the flowers up close. "They're odd," she said. "They are," he agreed. "I mean that as a compliment." "I know you do." She stood up. They were standing in the same spot, or close enough to it, where she'd held a quince in October and told Lily that some things needed heat to become what they were supposed to be. And the thing about her own words coming back to her in a different season was that they were still true, and they meant something different now than they had when she'd said them. She had been the quince, she thought, or they both had, or the thing between them had been the quince, astringent and strange at first, not sweet, not easy, nothing like what it was going to become. And the heat had been the ordinary, sustained presence of time spent honestly with another person, the 40-hour kitchen nights, and the Wednesday bakeries and the school gymnasiums and the Sunday honey cakes, and what had happened on the other side of all of it was this, a thing with its sour edges still intact, still honest, still itself, but undeniably richer and more itself than it had started. She was not going to tell Ethan this using the quince metaphor. She had some dignity, but she knew it, standing there in the May afternoon while someone else's anniversary celebration assembled itself on the other side of the estate. "Lily asked me something in February," she said. He looked at her. "What?" "Whether I lived here." He was quiet for a moment. "What did you say?" "I said I lived on Bancroft Street." "That's true." "It's less true than it was," she said. He was very still. The kind of still he got when something mattered, and he was not going to manage it into something smaller than it was. "What are you saying?" he said. She looked at the quince flowers, back at him. "I'm saying that I don't want to be here because I was rescued," she said. "I want that to be clear. I don't want a patron or benefactor or someone who's going to feel good about himself for helping the bakery lady. I can't be that. It would ruin everything that's actually here." "I know," he said. "I want to be here because I chose to be here," she said. "Because I looked at what this is and I chose it, not because it saved me anything." "That's what I want too," he said. "That's all I want." She looked at him. "I'm choosing it," she said. "I want you to know that." He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with ceremony. Just took it, the same way he'd handed her a water glass in a garden in October, with the quiet assurance of someone who had decided something and was no longer uncertain about it. "I know," he said. "I've been watching you choose it for months." They stood there for a moment in the May afternoon, with the quince flowers and the distant sound of a wedding happening elsewhere on the property, and the specific, uncomplicated weight of two people who had gotten things wrong and gotten themselves back, and were now, finally, simply here. "I told Lily," he said, "that I was in love with you." She said, "I know, Dad. I knew before you did." Grace stared at him. "She's 7, she said. "She's very 7, he agreed. "What did you say when she said that?" "I said she was probably right." He paused. "She usually is." Grace looked at the quince flowers for a moment, looked back at him. "I'm in love with you too," she said. "For whatever it's worth." "It's worth a lot," he said. "Good," she said. She squeezed his hand once, and then they walked back toward the house, because the wedding was going to start soon, and Lily had called twice in the last hour, asking where they were, and the shortbread they'd left in the kitchen that morning needed to be moved before the catering staff thought it was theirs. The reception ran into the evening. Grace and Ethan and Lily ate dinner at the small table in the kitchen. Not the dining room, the kitchen, as they almost always did. The three of them at the center island with whatever was easy, in the warm noise of a house that was full of other people celebrating something on the other side of the wall. After Lily went to bed, they sat on the back steps with the last of the spring warmth and listened to the distant music from the reception, something slow drifting over from the garden. "Full circle," Grace said. He looked at her. "You and your circles. I have a thing about them. I've noticed." They sat with the music and the dark and the quince bushes invisible now in the evening, just somewhere out there past the orchard path doing their quiet work. Later, when the wedding guests had gone and the estate had been returned to itself and Lily was solidly asleep with her books and her pasta architecture project and the dog she had finally won, a small brown mutt named Structure, her naming, final, non-negotiable, Grace stood in the kitchen doing the last of the dishes because it was her habit, and she couldn't leave a kitchen with dishes in the sink. Ethan stood beside her and dried. This was them, she thought. This was the actual thing. Not the grand version, not the version anyone told at dinner parties, not a love story that announced itself with speeches and gestures and the kind of cinematic clarity that made people feel like their own lives were slightly inadequate by comparison. Just this. Two people at a sink in a kitchen that smelled of cardamom and old wood and the particular living warmth of a home that had found its people, doing the ordinary work of an ordinary evening together. The water ran. The dishes got done. Outside somewhere, someone was driving home from a wedding. Somewhere, Clement Street was quiet in the May night, the bakery dark and locked, Patrice's holly wreath long replaced with whatever Patrice put up in spring. Somewhere, her mother in Clarksville was asleep in an apartment whose rent had been paid, as it was paid every month, because some things you carried not because you had to, but because they were yours. She was still those things. She was still the bakery and the second-hand furniture and the flower under the fingernails, and the woman who said okay to her own reflection in small bathrooms when the world didn't give her much to work with. She was also this. Both were true. Both could be true at the same time. She handed Ethan the last pan. He dried it. "Same time tomorrow?" he said. She looked at him. "I have a 6 a.m. bread batch." "I know. I'll have coffee made." She looked at the sink, turned off the water, looked at the kitchen. At this kitchen, which had held her in a way that few places had, which had given her back something she hadn't known she'd lost, which smelled of everything she'd made in it and would make again. "Yeah," she said. "Yeah?" "Same time tomorrow," she said. He put the pan away. She dried her hands. The kitchen light was warm and steady, and outside the May night was doing its quiet, permanent things, and somewhere on the grounds the quince was flowering in the dark, strange and honest and exactly what it was. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. 1 year later, a full year from the night in the October garden where two strangers had shared a water glass on a bench and needed a minute, there was another wedding at Callaway Estate. Grace and Ethan and Lily arrived together and found their seats. They chose the back row. Not because anyone had put them there, not because they had forgotten the way in or arrived too late or didn't know someone with a better seat. They chose it deliberately, the three of them, in the specific way you return to a place that matters, with intention, with the knowledge of what that spot had been and what it had become, with the quiet, private understanding that the people who knew where they were going didn't always need to be in the front. Lily sat between them and held the program with both hands and read it seriously from top to bottom, even though the ceremony hadn't started because she took programs seriously, she always had, and nobody was going to tell her otherwise. Structure the dog was at home with Cole, who had drawn the short straw and was taking it with Grace. The music started. Grace found Ethan's hand in the row between them, the way you found things you'd gotten used to having, without looking, without announcement, just the quiet certainty of something that was where you expected it to be. He held on. The last row was the best seat in the house. It always had been. They just hadn't known it until they'd sat there together.